A monster, in the form of a huge bull with a ring in its nose, advanced. The man called upon the Holy Spirit of Flame, asking it to grant him the flame of wrath, the fire magic of the salamander. He launched the magic straight at the target, causing a huge explosion. The world's greatest wizard, Douglas. A prosperous city with many adventurers. The metropolis of Balzac. People greeted him enthusiastically. He rolled a cart behind him, into which the monster he had killed was loaded. Douglas was called the greatest wizard by the people when he accidentally became the best in the local guild. At that time, he believed without any doubt that from that moment on he would continue to fight as an adventurer. And yet, at one point, he was told that his adventurer's license had been revoked. His card was no longer valid, and he would no longer be able to accept any assignments. 10 years had passed since then, and Douglas Ford was unemployed. And now he is a middle-aged man, 37 years old. He entered the Balzac Adventurers Guild. He was met by a guild member, Ding. He asked if he wanted to go through the procedure of returning the license card, but he didn't want to give it back. He wanted them to undo the revocation of his license. The guy had a particular understanding of why he wanted that. After all, he had just failed 3 rank quests in a row. Their guild no longer had any compelling reason to rely on him. The man understood how hard it was for them. Each adventurer's guild had something like collective guild points. This is a system where by completing quests assigned by the guild, the adventurer and the guild itself will gain guild points. The adventurer can gain various benefits with the points, but with each failed quest, the points are lost. It also benefits from points. If a guild loses too many guild points, the guild masters are demoted and the guild is closed. This can happen, and all because the quests he took were useless. However, who would have thought that his points would drop so much that even his license would be revoked? It had been 22 years since he had been an adventurer, and this year he turned 37. His body is decrepit, his physical stats are steadily declining. But what really plagues him is the strange illness he contracted a year ago. Every time he uses a skill, his max HP is reduced. Skills are very important for adventurers. Unfortunately, the maximum health he lost will never return. The doctor sitting next to him also said that it seems his body is becoming unable to handle the use of skills. This man was his doctor. He said that he had an unusual symptom and he had already observed it in several people, but if he continued to use the skills, his health would drop to 0 and he would die. Should he give up the life of an adventurer or die as an adventurer? But his single mother is not in this world and he has no family. He has dedicated his life to this path since he was 15 years old, and he has no other skills. Now that he's been through so much, he can't throw away everything he lived for. He brings a huge backpack filled with oddities to the guild, asking to look at it. It was all potions. He was sure that as long as they lasted, he wouldn't fail from exhaustion like he had in the past. The employees said they understood his desire. But Douglas, if he wasn't mistaken, was currently at level 68, but he has no more than 2,500 health. With such amount of health, he is no different from a beginner adventurer with level below 10. It would be better if he formed a team with a healer. But there were none for half a year. Trying to take a key crank quest that is recommended for people with an average level of around 30. Doesn't he realize how absurd that is? He certainly did. But the employee really didn't want to say something like that. But he had something to say to the hero. But at that moment, the person walking behind him told him to stop. That's enough. The guildmaster approached them. It was a relief to Douglas. He said he had a request for the master. Knowing him, he was sure he would not be refused. But his face was clearly not encouraging. He asked Douglas to stop. He knew that Douglas didn't like to make a mountain out of a molehill either. People were whispering on the sidelines, calling him an old man and saying that he kept grumbling. They'd all heard that his license had been revoked. They laughed at him. The master said that they were also indebted to Douglas. He had once been the best in the guild, and under no circumstances would they forget what he had achieved. And so they did not want him to die in vain. They wanted him to understand that. He had no choice but to leave. He sat at the entrance to the building and, sighing, thought about how he should finally take matters into his own hands and finally look the truth in the eye. Now he has neither powerful equipment nor money. Not only has he lost his license, but he also spends a lot on living expenses. It's time for him to come to terms with it. First, he should pack his things and make preparations to leave this city. He looked up and saw 4 heroes coming to meet him. This was the team of heroes he had been kicked out of 6 months ago. But it was almost 20 years younger than him. They had advanced quickly, which surprised him greatly, traveling together. Once he left this town, he would never see them again. It must be fate in some way. He walked up to the boys, greeting them, telling them how long it had been since they had seen each other. The first to greet him were Alan, who was a warrior, and Fanny, who was a healer. The girl greeted him, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time, and for her it was a great coincidence to meet in this city. Someone off to the side pointed out that it was no coincidence. He believed the man had waylaid them. It was Edmund, the sage. He said that no matter how many times Douglas asked, the answer would be the same. They couldn't take him back. He asked him to try to see things from their point of view, the ones he was persecuting. The hero denied it, saying he was wrong. Well, he had actually come to them before, once after his exile, to ask if they could change their minds. But he certainly didn't follow, although at that moment he was extremely persistent. He admits it. He decided to admit to the guys that in fact he decided to leave the city today. While he was getting ready, he accidentally stumbled upon them, so he thought of saying goodbye one last time. Fanny was very surprised. The sage smiled. He sarcastically noted that he did not think there was a city where adventurers could live even easier than here. But then, for what reason did the man decide to leave? The hero scratched his cheek with his finger, not even knowing how to answer. At that moment, Dario, who was the swordsman on the team, appeared and jumped out from the side and began to mock that. Despite the answer, how heartless it sounded from Edmund, asked the old man if he agreed, and then noted that the license had already been taken away, hadn't it? Yes, and that huge baggage behind him. What was he going to do next? Sell potions? He had hit rock bottom now. Another mistake, but he will definitely die. The sage also laughed, saying that it reminded him of something. He asked how much his health had dropped since then. Alan, standing behind him, screamed at the top of his lungs that they had to stop. It was amazing. All he does is tell them to stop wasting their time. He asked old Douglas for forgiveness, but they were in a hurry, so he had to go. The hero stuttered and apologized to the boys for keeping them up with his chatter. He waved goodbye to the girl, and she nodded her head in response. Despite his position as a hero, Alan never showed his emotions. Was it possible that he was standing up for him now? He will wish them well as long as he travels. 3 months have passed since he left Balzac. He has continued his pointless journey. Now he takes any job that does not require a license, and then, having earned enough for the journey, he goes to the next city. And so on, every day. When he turned 15, he became an adventurer because he wanted to live for humanity. Despite his mother's attempts to hold him back, he wanted to do good. And yet, even though he became an adventurer for this, before, if he fought and there was a chance of dying, he would act harshly, enjoying himself. And even when his health began to decrease, he continued to use skills. But now he is definitely afraid of death. Even though he has lost his license and the pride he tried to keep, even at the risk of his life. Despite everything, he still clings to life. But now he's all alone and feels very sorry for himself. He wandered through the dense forest until he realized that it was already deep night. Behind him, a shadow was walking in the opposite direction. If he could get out of this forest, there would be a border checkpoint further on. There were many dangers in the forest at night. If he could get there before it closed, somehow, it wouldn't be so bad. Suddenly, the acrid smell of blood reached his nose. He walked forward through the bushes in the direction from which the smell was coming. In front of him, he saw a huge monster in the form of a wolf lying on the ground. It silently looked at the man, sighing heavily from pain. She looked at the man without looking away. It was Fenrir. After 3 years of the Demon King's revival, demons and monsters in this world became a threat to the very existence of humans. But Fenrir was rare even among demons. It was not often that he appeared in human lands. And yet, there he lay, right in front of him. He was bleeding terribly. A hunter must have attacked him. The man walked towards the monster, saying that even though he was a demon, he did not want to kill him without a reason. He would like to save him if he could, but it was beyond his power. Suddenly, the demon stood up on its front paws and, looking at the man, bared its teeth. The man was scared. He said that he understood his fear, but he was not going to harm him. He noticed some kind of magic circle on the demon's stomach. It was a cursed seal, and he did not understand how he got under the curse. Curses are forbidden skills that are used to cause suffering to the enemy. The effects vary depending on the type of cursed seal. But more than that, it is a curse of reincarnation. There is a man inside this Fenrir. He asked about it directly. A curse that turns a man into a beast. The demon's eyes began to water. He doesn't understand why anyone would do something like this. Although the reason doesn't matter now. At this rate, this man will die. One way or another, this curse needs to be lifted. Douglas threw his backpack on the ground and headed towards the monster. It was okay. He had removed curses many times in the past. Even if his strength was lower than in his prime, it didn't mean that the technique and knowledge had disappeared. He remembered what the doctor had said, that if he continued using the skills and his health dropped to 0, he would die. He remembered that he didn't have the same strength as before. Spell Dispel was a powerful skill. It would finish off his already low HP. Well, it seemed like this was the last time he would save anyone. As an adventurer, but if you think about it, it's not so bad to leave like that. He told the demon that he would now remove the spell from him and asked her to be a good girl. The monster began to whine for the whole area to hear, but the magician asked her not to be afraid. He would definitely heal her. One way or another, he wanted to do good. He wanted to live for someone else. Instead of a futile and aimless life, he would use his life worthily for the last time. He began to chant, asking for the shimmering particles, and hopes to gather here and now. He commanded the spell to be dispelled. He knew that his strength would fade, and his health would disappear. A sharp pain had already pierced his body. However, he had already finished the spell. And he hopes that her wounds will heal as well. The magic threw him into the nearest tree. He opened his eyes, very surprised that he was still alive. He did not understand what had happened, why he was alive. This wasn't a dream. The seal was still active, and this moment was not clear to him. He quickly opened his status window. It said his name was Douglas Ford, race, human, job, unemployed. Level 68, health 36, 2,900. Mana, 510,432. He was extremely surprised by his health condition, 60,900. He was ready to swear that last time it was 2,500. Could it be that his status had regressed to the previous indicators? The spell was completed. However, not only did the seal remain, but the skill was simply reflected without having any effect. It's just his guess, but it seems like the skill was reflected and hit him. So not only did he not die from health depletion, but on the contrary, he returned to his previous indicators, which meant he was cursed too. Now it all seems quite logical, and he thought that his condition was caused by aging or some rare diseases. It must have disappeared after the skill bounced back at him. In that case, just think, he didn't even notice the curse that was placed on him. What an idiot he was. However, it should have manifested itself as a status ailment. Why has no one noticed it yet? So who put the curse on him? Well, he could think about that later. Right now, he needed to deal with the demon. The bleeding hadn't stopped. Something had to be done quickly. Otherwise, things could end very badly. But since the Dispel spell was reflected from her, it means that a forbidden spell was cast on her. A forbidden spell is one of the strongest curses, and only the one who cast it can remove it. In other words, he can't turn this Fenrir back into a human. But if you think about it, if only the one who cast the curse could lift it, then all he has to do is become one, right? The monster looked at him strangely. When he began to lag behind Alan and the others in terms of capabilities, he wanted to close the gap, so he desperately studied the information regarding skills. If he has one copy skill that allows him to transform his voice and appearance of someone he knows, he can use it to take on the appearance of the one who cast the curse. At least, he would like to say so. But he has no idea who he is, so he will have to exchange information through recall using the appropriate skill with the wolf. Having learned about the caster, he will change his appearance, and in this state, he will remove the curse. In theory, this should work. However, in parallel, use skills or resort to using the second. There is only one person who has achieved such mastery, and this was a hero, Alan, because he became famous for this unique ability. The king awarded him the title of hero. That's how unique the ability to use skills in parallel is. How would Tony feel now that his powers were back? He definitely had to try. He began casting the Soul Mind Gate spell, asking it to open up and become a part of him. He used the memory swap. He touched the forehead of the huge demon, and the memories of the girl who ran from some strange man were transmitted to him. He saw what the caster was like and his appearance. Now he needs to use the form. It's okay. Even if he uses several skills, he won't lose his health anymore. Everything will work out. He started the spell to increase the common sense that lies behind the form and commanded to imitate. He took the form of the same man who had bewitched the girl, but he knew he couldn't hold out for long. He needed to use both imitation and dispersal faster. He collected particles of hope here and now and swayed. Dispel the unique spell. Sharp gusts of wind appeared throughout the area. The spell wore off, and in front of him sat a little girl who had not been a demon until recently. She was very young. After turning, she had no clothes on. Lend her your coat. Anyway, he was glad she was okay. He asked her how her voice was, if she could speak. She did, albeit slowly. They looked at each other in silence. He was confused, because she was a quiet girl. He had no idea how to behave with children her age at such moments. Well, what a start. He needed to do something. He read the spells of the magnanimous goddess to grant him as the protector of life, healing, and thus completely restore the girl's health. He asked her if she was in pain anywhere, and she said that she was fine now. Mr. Great Magician, cured her after all, so she's fine now. The man said he wasn't a great magician, just a friendly middle-aged neighbor. Later, they were sitting by the fire and cooking. The man realized that he still hadn't introduced himself, and he said that he was Douglas Ford, and the girl's name was Ravi. He asked her if she remembered the city she lived in. He could walk her home at dawn, but the girl was silent at first, and then answered that she had nowhere else to return to. The man asked why and what happened to her family. It turns out she didn't have a family either, so she's all alone. But there must have been a place where she lived before the curse. The girl screamed, saying she didn't want to go back anywhere but there. The man was surprised. She was so scared. What the hell had just happened to her? If she didn't want it, he wouldn't take her there. He had promised her, but he was confused. It seems she has her reasons. Just leaving her in the nearest town would be a bad idea. However, he has some acquaintances, so it's not all bad. He said that it's a bit far, but there is a town called Balzac, and he will try to find someone to take care of her there. It will be a long way, but he hopes that she does not mind. She asked if it would be difficult for him to do this, answering that of course not. He smiled, looking at her. The food was finally ready, but there was one more dish to prepare. The girl wanted to say something, but since the man did not hear, he asked again, but she had already turned her head in embarrassment, refusing to speak again. The man was cutting apples on a board. He cut them into thin slices and fried them separately. If fried on both sides, they would become soft and tender. He served them to the girl, wishing her a pleasant appetite. For dinner, there was bread with apples and pork soup. It smelled very sweet, but she had to be careful because it was hot. The girl took a bite of the offered food and waved her legs with happiness. He was very pleased that she was pleased. After all, the fire produced an unusual interaction of bittersweet apples and dry bread. In addition, you can make a rich dashi broth from dried pork. You have to cook it until the meat gives off fat and becomes soft. It was just delicious. Ravi was shaking all over, and the man asked what was wrong with her. Did she really not like something, or was something hurting her? But it turns out it was because everything was just so amazing. She thanked him with tears in her eyes for saving her. He wanted to live for someone and do good, but what was saved was a middle-aged man and a mysterious girl named Ravi. He should tell her the same thing. Their fleeting journey begins with this. Ravi was sleeping on a bedclothes on the ground. She opened her eyes, and the man, noticing this, wished her good morning, asking if she had slept well. She was sorry that she had slept while he was watching over her, but he didn't understand what she was talking about. After all, they say that children grow in their sleep and she needs it. But before the move, they need to do something. He made homemade shoes for the girl from bags. She was surprised that the bags had become shoes. He had only tied them with string and looked rather poor. But perhaps she should be patient for a little while. She smiled and said that it was not true and that she would take care of them. She thanked him. This is a very good girl. Since the preparations are finished, it is time for them to move out. He called Ravi, who was sitting with her back to him. It turned out that she had found something on the ground. It was shiny and shimmering. He asked if she remembered anything about this necklace. But she shook her head. He found it hard to even imagine that something like this could be lost so deep in the mountains. When special devices are used, the effects of spells and magical skills are enhanced. There is a high probability that it was used to curse Ravi. He held it out to her, asking if she wanted to wear it. He had already broken the curse, so it would be all right if she kept it. But she didn't want that. In that case, she would have to sell it in town. And for now, he would keep it. Not a long journey in good company. They are now in the northern region of the Kingdom of Lais. The metropolis of Balzac is located in the southwest of the country, so they are heading south. This part of the region is all untouched forests and wilderness, and roads have not yet been built. The only people who pass through here are traveling merchants. There is not a single carriage that travels the main roads. He figured that keeping quiet would be boring, so he was more talkative than usual on the way. He is not very good at talking, but Ravi listened attentively to his chatter. Ravi seemed to enjoy the stories of his past travels. They've just met, but he feels different. Not like before, when he wandered aimlessly around the world. They say there's no long way to go in good company, but company really is nicer. After a while, they were already there. In McFadden. It is a small village with a hotel, which is combined with a small shop and a church in the northern part of the village. Besides, he spent the night there the day before. He went inside the building, greeting the owner. He asked if he could have 2 sets of clothes, shoes, and underwear for the girl, as well as some soup and towels. The owner told him to come in and wait a minute while she prepared everything for him. Although she was his daughter, he still decided to remain silent. She had shoes only made of wood and leather. She asked which ones they preferred. The man asked which ones would not hurt if worn for a long time. It was more comfortable in wooden ones. They will protect from moisture and are more resistant to water and cold compared to leather. Thinks that they will suit her. Children grow quickly, so she chose underwear a size larger. Then she asked if they needed anything else. The man also wanted to see the leather flask, but unfortunately they were out of stock. In that case, the man said he would look for it in the nearest town. An old man overheard their conversation and asked if they were going to travel to Addington. He had a little shop there, so they could meet there. He usually deals with the evaluation of goods that people bring him, using his skills. But he does not like to sit in his shop all the time. So he leaves everything to his son and goes to trade small things. The man was interested in the appraisal, so he pulled out a necklace they had recently found and asked him how much he thought it would fetch. The old man adjusted his glasses and said it looked like an antique. He needs 1 moment to use his appraisal skills now. The mistress said that there is no need for Grandpa Theo's skill. He can appraise even without it. They examined the necklace through the lens. It was a black pearl, and the woman thought it would fetch about 20 silver at the market. She could buy it from them if they wanted. 20 silver was already pretty good, in principle. That would be enough for a month's supply of food. It was a good price for a black pearl. However, it was used for a forbidden spell. The magical effects of gemstones are much stronger than normal ones. Most likely, this is not an ordinary black pearl. It turned out to be a black obsidian pearl. The name and shape are similar, but the price is completely different. This thing is a very valuable item that can only be obtained from the eyes of a rare black tiger shrimp. The woman was surprised that the thing in front of her was the eye of a black tiger shrimp. The old man said that she could not afford it. After all, not having any skills, she could not give a normal price for this product. Douglas stood up, beginning his incantation, asking the Almighty God to turn the pages of the Book of Knowledge and grant him the wisdom of an appraising judge. Through skill, he realized that it definitely resembled a black obsidian pearl. The woman and the old man were spitting in shock. They were shouting at the top of their lungs, asking if he could use the appraisal skill. And the old man thought they were travelers, but in fact they were merchants. The man hastened to assure them that they were ordinary wanderers, but as they saw, he had some skills. The women were shouting, "What with such skills? And he is not even a merchant." Grandfather noted that high-level adventurers could very well acquire some skills. Although even if that were the case, that would mean he was a high-level skill user. But the hero replied that if we were to talk about it, he was not such an outstanding adventurer. Even though he had the skill of appraisal, he understood the prices, so he apologized if they felt awkward because of him. The old man laughed, saying that he had been completely fooled by his modesty. The landlady remarked that, nevertheless, having such a skill of evaluation, even if he was not a merchant, then almost like their brother, they didn't have that much on hand at the moment. But if he went into the old man's shop in Addington, he would buy it at least at market value. The old man gave his name as Theo. He would look forward to their next meeting. Later, they went into another shop. The owner greeted them. She remembered that he had come in recently and asked if he would stay the night. Well, as she saw, something had indeed happened. The woman saw the little girl, asking who she was. She was not with him last time. The man did not even know what to answer about this. The woman looked at him strangely, saying that he didn't look like a kidnapper, so she wouldn't poke her nose into something that wasn't her business. But even if she was a child, if she occupied the bed, she would take it as if it were an adult. The man agreed to this. However, the girl is pretty dirty. The mistress can't let her sleep in this condition, so she needs to wash her thoroughly before entering the house. She will take the tub out to the backyard. The man was carrying a bucket of water. Since he could now use skills, he didn't have to go out of his way just to get water, but limit the strength. He asked the Holy Spirit of Water, who was looking for the love of desolate souls, to grant him blessed water, the magic of Undine's water. And at Kurita, where the girl washed her clothes, huge magic spheres began to appear. She looked at the picture in amazement. It was just amazing. To be able to use his powers again, like before. He had never understood what it was like. Until recently. He asked Ravi what was the matter. She said that on second thought she had found something next to the necklace, but forgot to tell him. She'd asked if she could sell that too. It was a beautiful ring. The man remembered. Alan's parents were killed in front of his eyes when he was a child. He was going to avenge them. He swore on the ring that his mother left him. This is exactly what he told him when he showed this same ring in the past. It couldn't have been a mistake. The dragon ruby was undoubtedly a memory of his parents, whose memory he treasured. But he didn't remember him trusting him with the ring. And it was unlikely that it could have accidentally ended up in his luggage. So why was it found in the mountains? Although he already knows why, he just doesn't want to believe it. He regained his former strength after an unexpected hit from the spell Dispel, the cursed accessory that remained near Ravi in the ring. The one who cursed him was Alan. Alan is fucking creepy. And why did he stand up for him then? Although it's not just that. Loss of license, and then just waiting for death. And his former, as he considered, comrade doomed him to such a fate. While he was thinking, the magic dissipated and the water drops turned into rain, completely soaking Ravi and the man along with her. He did not understand what he had done to make him so angry. Nothing came to mind. Apparently that was the problem. He must have been indifferent and didn't notice someone's offense. Ravi sat on the ground, soaking wet. She asked him what was wrong with him. But the man decided to convince her that it was nothing special. For a girl, this was nothing special. It was his face that showed how much it hurt. He agreed with it. He was no liar. And Ravi was a perceptive child. There was no point in lying about his feelings anymore. He sat down on the ground telling Ravi to listen. The ring she had found had once been treasured by a former comrade of his. So they would not sell the ring. They would return it to its former owner, and he would find out why he had cursed it. The owner came out into the yard and asked why the hell they were both sitting there wet. In that case, she decided to bathe the child herself instead of him. So he needs to go get himself cleaned up. The man said he could handle it himself. The woman shut him down because she was a girl. He needed to show some respect. The man realized what he had done wrong and walked away. He thought it was normal not to worry about such things, since she was still a child, albeit a stranger. But she was right about one thing. The man shaved his beard with a knife. He didn't know much about such things. Someone shouted from behind, drawing his attention to her. It was the owner, who had already arrived with the washed child, and was asking what he thought about Robbie's trimmed bangs. They were too long, so she had them shortened with permission. The girl was obviously pleased. The hostess was waving at him to say something about it. He noticed that she was very nice for a child. They had already gone inside and sat down at the table. The hostess was serving dishes to the table, and she said, however, she kept wondering why he had come back to such a village again. But he had gone on a journey to pick up his daughter, hadn't he? She asked Ravi. She must have fun traveling with her dad. But the girl, hearing the words about her father, was very upset, looking at the plate. He remembered what she had said earlier, and that she had no family. She must really miss her father. Or maybe he had already gone to the next world. He has not yet been curious or questioned her, because he thinks she does not want to touch on the subject. However, even if they part, they will have to travel several months in Balzac. So it would be a pretty lonely story, because they were complete strangers to each other. He didn't understand how much distance he needed to keep from her. But everything would be fine as long as he got closer to her step by step. The man looked at his hand, which held coins. That was all the money he had left. He would soon have to find a permanent job. The child thanked him for the food, saying that it was very tasty. The man was surprised that she ate so quickly. But in that case, she needed to rest a bit and go to the hotel. He called the girl who was looking out the window. She noticed a huge house at the end of the settlement. 5 days had passed since they had set out for the south of McFadden village. He and Robbie had finally arrived in this town, the charity town of Addington, where Theo's grandfather's shop was located. Addington was built on gently rolling land, and on the high ground, on the northern shore, is the Matlock Orphanage. In large cities, as a rule, there are orphanages, but most of them are experiencing serious financial difficulties, so practically none of them can match this one in elegance. And so, about the reason why the shelters in this city still remain decent. The owner of the establishment approached them, asking if they were travelers. She saw that they had noticed the building and said that it was a wonderful orphanage. It seemed that the director had once been successful in trade and was now investing in the education of orphans. It's quite remarkable, Peeping Society. And this is what they came up with. By the way, this is the 4th time he's heard a story like this. It's amazing that he's heard nothing but positive stories about his reputation, wherever he goes. I think he needs to make sure Robbie doesn't feel controlled by him, too. They moved forward down the street past the passing carriages. The man saw that she was paying attention to them. He asked her if she had ever ridden them, but she hadn't had the chance. If they went a little further south, they would see stagecoaches. Sooner or later, he would give her a ride. Stagecoaches were multi-seat, horse-drawn carriages that carried people and mail. Now he often sees her smiling. It must be because of her short bangs. They noticed how the man was leaving the building, and the children nearby were thanking the principal for sweets, and he was saying that it was not worth it, and that they should watch their steps. He paid attention to this man. Could this man be the director of the city orphanage? And these children who were nearby were dressed in clothes almost like nobility. Compared to them, the clothes he bought were too simple for Ravi. He looked at the girl. Her expression was clearly different from when she was happy when she heard about the carriages. People have that kind of face when they really want something. She must really be jealous of those cute outfits. At that moment, the kids who had just been talking to the principal were running straight at her, and the man shouted at her. The girl saw that they were running towards her and tripped, falling backwards. The principal and Douglas caught their children in time, and everything turned out well. Douglas looked at Ravi, asking if she was okay. The director also inquired about the condition of his children, and turned to the magician, asking for forgiveness on behalf of his children. The hero said that they were not paying attention either, and asked Ravi if she could stand up now. The announcer, noticing them, said that he should apologize. It seemed that he had jumped to conclusions that the two of them were father and daughter, but the man didn't understand how he understood it. It turns out, because of the distance they keep with each other, even when he extended his hand, this girl hesitated to take it. If the two of them were father and daughter, this would never have happened. The explanation was generally clear. Then the director asked what kind of relationship they had. Douglas thought he might now be suspected of kidnapping children. He explained that they were simply father and daughter out of a sense of duty. And only recently, the announcer said that he believed that his life had changed dramatically in that case. The hero noted that he had enough worries as it was, but he had coped. The director asked what worries he was talking about. It can't be that he himself is courting a little girl who is not related to him by blood. The hero realized that he had said too much. Then the director said what he thought. Of course, it was impertinent of him to say such a thing, but it seemed that the two of them were in some kind of trouble. He runs the orphanage in this town, Matlock. He wanted to give him some advice, if that was okay with him. It must be hard to look after a little girl. Traveling with a child limits the distance one can travel. And he also can't just ignore the child while she sleeps. He thinks he was on guard last night. More importantly, he is sure that they have more expenses than when he was on his own. He has many children entrusted to him due to various situations. The man understands what he is hinting at, but he cannot do this. He suggests that he leave Ravi in an orphanage. Why did the conversation end like this? The man shouted that he was grateful for their offer, but they were completely fine. He grabbed the girl and ran away. The director, who was watching, was shocked. They finally entered the hotel. The girl sat on the edge of the bed silently. Since returning to the hotel, Ravi was not herself. She just looked at those clothes and was silent. She compared her clothes with those of the children from the orphanage. The girl called Douglas and, clutching her shirt, asked if it was expensive. The man, scratching his face, said it was cheap and apologized. He was ashamed of it. The girl replied that she was glad about it. The man didn't understand why she was happy. Was Ravi worried about something other than her clothes? Or was she just thinking about him? But wasn't she consumed with envy? He almost forgot that he had run away because of the director's suggestion. But he wondered what Ravi thought. There were many children about her age. Surely they could live without any discomfort. This simply couldn't be true. Was it possible that Ravi wanted to go to the orphanage? That was what he had asked her. If it was true, he was apologizing for refusing the director without thinking. The girl had a shocked expression on her face. If she wanted, he could go and ask him tomorrow. He wanted to know how she felt, but she shook her head. He asked again, really? And there was no need for him to ask, and she threw it. He breathed a sigh of relief. He abruptly opened the door and said that he would be back and that she should wait here, and left. It was a relief to him. It didn't look like she wanted to go to a shelter. However, if she did, then at least he wanted to dress her up nicely. If she stays like this, she will be miserable wherever they go. He only managed to buy a small gift, but he hopes that she will be happy with at least that. He burst into the hotel, sorry for the past, but saw that the girl was not there. He saw a note on the table. Taking it in his hands, he asked what it was. The note said that the girl thanked him for everything. She was happy next to him, but she went to the shelter. The man immediately moved towards the door. He had no experience in raising children, and he was already thinking about sending Ravi to one of his friends. If it was just a chance to live without any inconvenience, the location didn't matter. He told Ravi that he wanted to know how she felt. And just like she had answered, he deliberately avoided her gaze and ran away. He shouldn't follow her. It all became clear to him. The gift he had bought had fallen to the floor and was already worn out. A little later, he went into Theo's department store. He watched through the glass door as his son told his father to leave the inventory to him, because he was too old for it. The old man, he already knew, said that he was much stronger than his frail son. The hero entered the shop and was greeted immediately. The old man finally recognized him, saying that he was glad that he had come to see him. Had he finally come to give him his necklace? But there was a problem with that, because this necklace originally belonged to another child he used to hang out with back in the day, so he thinks he'll give it back to him later. So he's very sorry, but he doesn't think he'll ever be able to sell it to the old man. Theo, not understanding where he was going with this, decided to drop the subject. After all, he was interested in what happened to the girl who owned the necklace, and the man told him what had happened during this time. After hearing the whole story, the merchant's son said that it was really good. The girl was very lucky. He was sure that she would be happy. The man realized that it was true after all. Theo said that he didn't like the man. He had never heard of a merchant who didn't cling to his earnings. His son said that his father was at it again. Told the hero not to pay attention to him. His father is practically the only one in this town who speaks badly of the director. He said that he made an excellent choice, entrusting her to the director, since even when looking for adoptive parents, he will refuse anyone who is not a nobleman. There are already many children who have flown the director's nest. This city is already quite comfortable to live in, and they still leave it. It was strange. This place itself is a big city, but don't they say that the eastern continent is on a completely different level? He must know that if he goes from here to the southeast, he will reach the port, and from there he can cross the ocean. The man asked him, when he said cross the ocean, if he meant the port town of Shipton. But the only people who can dock at Shipton are small short-haul fishing boats and merchant ships. He's had some disagreements with the guild, so he's pretty sure no passenger ships have stopped here in years. 10 years ago, the eastern continent was subjected to fierce invasions by the Demon King, and the demon's cruelty knew no end. This story was told to him when he went east from Shipton to destroy them. He remembers it well. However, the director had gained a lot of influence when he returned with his acquaintances on a merchant ship, so he could send for a ship at any time. The man was scared. It was impossible. Alan's group probably managed to secure the eastern continent temporarily. However, this city is now in danger again. Well, for a start, it doesn't seem like this merchant knows about the Demon King's invasions. Is it possible that the director is sending the children away without knowing anything? But the one who delivers the children always arrives safely at the eastern port. If the director does not know about it, then this person is simply hiding them. But for what reason exactly? However, he could not leave Ravi in such a place. He apologized, saying that he was sorry, and immediately ran out of the shop. The old man's son asked what had happened out of the blue. He replied that he was going to bring Ravi back. A little later, approaching the shelter, he knocked on the door, out of breath after a long run. The door opened in front of him, and the director stood there. Seeing the already familiar man, he asked what business he had with him. The man replied that he had come to pick up Ravi. The director did not understand why he should pick her up. After all, this girl wanted to come here herself, didn't she? She had told him about it yesterday. He had told him about it yesterday. He knew it. But it was just a misunderstanding. He takes Ravi and wants to see her. He said that it was very good and most likely she was in the garden with other children. He would show him the way. There were indeed a lot of children in the garden. The heroes looked around, looking for Ravi. Noticing her, he shouted her name and ran towards her. She asked why he was there, and he replied that he had come for her, and now they could go home. At first, the girl was happy and was about to extend her hand. But something stopped her. The girl replied that he would have problems if she stayed with him, so she wanted to stay here. He remembered the time the principal had said that it must be difficult to look after a little girl, that traveling with a baby limits the distance one can travel, and he also can't just ignore the baby while he sleeps. And he thinks that the baby is on guard. He was so absorbed in himself that he completely forgot to think about Ravi, who was listening to all this behind his back. More importantly, he was sure that they had more expenses than when they were on their own. She heard this too. Given the girl's calm and reserved nature, he should have guessed her feelings. Then, and in various other situations, she felt that her very existence would be a heavy burden for him. It only dawned on him now. He was on his knees asking her for forgiveness. He had failed to properly consider her feelings and, in the end, he had misunderstood and rushed out. That was all. He had asked her for forgiveness. She had said that no apology was necessary, but he never even considered that Ravi would be a burden to him. On the contrary, he would be happy if they could travel together. So he asked her again if she wanted to come back to him. The girl, clutching her clothes with her palms, asked if she really wasn't a burden, and upon hearing a negative answer, she immediately threw herself into the man's arms. Honestly, she didn't want to leave. Now she was crying very hard, hugging him. The director, who came up to them, clapped her hands, saying that it was wonderful. He was so touched that he was ready to cry. He wanted to help many people, but he couldn't keep her now, since she wanted to leave. In that case, he could see them off. The man said that before he left, he wanted to ask Principal Matlock something. He heard that all the children from the orphanage would be sent to the eastern continent. But didn't that apply to sending children across the ocean? The director confirmed this. That is why he sometimes sees them off and goes to the eastern continent to check. It is hard for him to visit them often, but the last time he was there was a year ago. Douglas asked what he understood. The place must be nice. Of course, in the director's opinion, it was very lively there, and every day there was a festive atmosphere. The children who had moved in looked extremely happy. Indeed, this meant that he had not been deceived back then. 3 years had passed since the eastern continent had once again been tormented by the 4 heavenly lords, the Demon Lord, including the industrial city of Bourbon, which is under their control. And yet he says they seemed incredibly happy living in such a city. In general, the traveler cannot visit there. And even if someone manages to get into the city by pure chance, he is sure that they will definitely not be allowed to leave it. The director wipes the sweat from his face with his handkerchief. He asked not to say loud words because it couldn't be. He saw it all with his own eyes. Douglas replied that it was strange, because he saw it with his own eyes too. The director asked the children to come into the house for a while, and they all obediently went inside. It seemed that he intended to take the children out if necessary. The director did not understand what he was talking about. There was no need to show his favorite product. He would have to kill him. With a wave of his hand, people came out from all sides with weapons. It turns out that these are the workers of the shelter, who were also involved. However, leading Ravi behind his back, he told her to remember, whatever happens, he will protect her. The director gave the order to kill the man with the child. At that moment, the hero began to read the spell, asking the goddess guardian of the sacred land to grant him a chilling kiss, Hell's ice magic, and he struck the ground, turning everything around him into ice, freezing even the people nearby. The director finally realized that he was an offensive skill user. Douglas asked Ravi to wait for him at the place and went to the director. He asked him where the children who left the orphanage were, but the director said that he did not know. But the magician can simply turn his body into ice and grant him a freezing death. The director screamed. Was he really threatening him? He was probably just bluffing. His face didn't show that he was capable of murder. But at that moment, the smile on the magician's face was sinister. It was a very creepy face. It turned out he'd simply copied the director's face, but he shouldn't have done that. He didn't mind if he confessed. There were others here, and they seemed to know what was going to happen next. He'd just interrogate them as soon as the director died. Finally, he decided to confess, saying that he had sold the children of some perverted nobility to strange establishments. The man asked what kind of establishments they were. At this point, the director screamed, but all the while calling for the military police, asking them to help him. He screamed that a dirty old man was going to kill him. The man nearby. People, hearing the scream, asked what was wrong with the director. Matlock. The director was confident of his victory. He thought the hero had let his guard down. He still had one skill he could use. He summoned the holy spirit of flame, the fire magic of the salamander. The hero saw the projectile flying at him and his eyes widened. Since the director could remove him, everything would remain a secret. No one in this city would believe a wanderer like him, and the director will remain in his position as director tomorrow. The hero put his hand in front of the projectile and knocked it aside. The director was confused by this turn of events. He shouted, asking to wait, and apologized, saying that it was his fault. But that same moment he got punched in the face. The hero will hardly wait. Ravi ran up and asked Daddy if he was okay. He answered that he was fine, and only then realized what she called him. The military police ran towards him, calling the director. They heard a scream just now and saw what was happening, how the director was unconscious, as were the others sitting in the ice. They wanted to ask something, but having noticed the girl clinging to the man, they fell silent. They asked to be told and explained what had happened here. Then, with a list of clients found in the director's room, they managed to convince the military police to believe their story. They are going to find the trafficked children by any means necessary. Not only have they confirmed his intentions, but it looks like he is going to bring them home. People couldn't believe it. To think that everyone in the city had been deceived by this man. It looks like volunteers will now be taking turns looking after the children from the shelter. The fact that there are caring people living in this city is their only salvation. They arrived at the hotel again. The girl was examining the box that was a gift to her. She asked what happened to it. It was crumpled. The man replied that it was supposed to be a gift for her. Well, the box had changed, though. She asked if she could open it, and saw a beautiful bow inside. He had bought it when he left the house and left her here alone. He felt ashamed she had to wear cheap clothes, so he acted strangely at that moment. The girl apologized for leaving alone. She asked if she could put it on, and he decided that he could put it on for her himself. Taking the bow, he pinned it to her hair and said it suited her very well. She asked why he had given her the bow. It turned out that he had given it to someone. They had met some children from the orphanage. She looked at their charming dresses with envy. That's what he thought. The girl, embarrassed, said that it was not so. She was not looking at the dresses, but at the sweets that they had. Finally, the man understood what was going on and laughed. When it comes to anger, despair, and sadness, it is in a joyful meeting that people overcome them. It seems that he, a loner, still has a lot to learn as a father. The night was still far from over. Now they needed to admire the moonlight together. So far, so good. The military police ordered them to stay in this city because of the incident with Director Matlock. They will most likely stay in Addington for the next 4 or 5 days. At this moment, they were sitting at a table in a tavern and eating. He's planning to take on some part-time work to earn some money for their trip. But I wonder what Ravi will do. Will she wait for him at the hotel? Or she wants to stay with him? But if it's work, she probably can't. In that case, he suggested that they go together. She asked if it was really possible and if she wouldn't get in the way. He denied it, and most importantly, he would be able to protect her as best as possible, for it could be said that there was no place safer than next to him. However, since it came to that, he had a proposal for her. From now on, wherever they go, he thinks that they should maintain the father-daughter relationship. This is also to make sure that a situation like the one that happened the other day does not happen again. So from now on, he would call Ravi his daughter in front of others. Accordingly, she should also call him Daddy. She had a rather strange expression on her face from embarrassment. Because of him, he asked if everything was okay. If she didn't want it, then fine. But that wasn't what she wanted to say. She didn't know if she could really call him that. He said that of course she could, and let her try calling him that now. And, a little embarrassed, she called him Dad. The man even looked embarrassed. The girl thought that it sounded, apparently, quite strange judging by his face. But he didn't say that. He just felt very awkward. And now they need to take the quest. 2 days later. The day of the quest. They were walking with the child through the forest. He asked Ravi if she was cold, but she was fine. The adventurer walking ahead clicked his tongue. He turned around and shouted that if he took on a task with the child, was he looking down on them? If it was just a walk for him, he should go home now. The magician replied that he would not cause him any trouble. He realized that this man was the commander of the self-defense forces they were traveling with this time. He seemed quite menacing, the complete opposite of himself. The task this time from the locals was to subdue a red-eyed dragon. The quests that the Adventurers Guild offers are usually related to personal matters, so the reward and difficulty are often not great. However, quests that do not go through the guild come directly from the city or country. Sometimes they can be taken even without a license at the cost of higher complexity. Red-eyed dragons are incredibly fierce and aggressive magical beasts. Their favorite delicacy is humans. And every year, waking up from hibernation, they begin to create nests in the mountains near human settlements. Thus, this city of Addington has been exterminating dragons for several years. In the middle of the journey, they decided to take a break for lunch. The man and the child were sitting apart from everyone else. The girl was eating sandwiches, saying that the eggs tasted very light. She thought it was very tasty. He was glad to hear it. He cooked everything himself this morning, using the hotel kitchen. They had egg sandwiches and beef meatball soup on the menu. One of the guys sitting separately with a bandaged head came up to them and asked what they were eating. Was it really meatball soup? The rest of the guys sitting in the distance heard about the meatballs and realized what that delicious aroma was. The soup would certainly warm their frozen bones. Douglas thought they had some soup left, but he asked Ravi what she thought about it, and she nodded. The magician suggested to the others that if they wanted, they could eat. They didn't have much, so they would have to share one pot. But he was sure that it would still warm them up a little. The man asked if he was sure, even though they were pleased with the bad attitude towards the two of them. But smiling, he said that there was no need to worry about it. Working together with strangers, of course, they would be on guard. The others scratched their heads in embarrassment. If he said so, they didn't mind. In their opinion, he seemed like a good guy. The very first one who came up took a sip of soup from a glass and said that it was delicious, and he had never tasted anything better. They asked what kind of meat he put there. He wanted to answer, but turned around, seeing the same bearded man who yelled at him on the road. The guy next to him said that if he was thinking about that bearded man, then it was not worth it. Just leave him alone. For these words, they called him by the name Noish. They were clearly outraged by what he said. The young man said that then, why don't the guys just go and talk to him? But they refused. They told him that he was leading them, so there was no point in ruining a relationship. The magician decided to approach the man himself, telling him that he would freeze here And why not just eat some soup with them? The man on this one just looked at him angrily. He started shouting again, saying why were they all pestering him with their food? He insulted them, saying that they had already forgotten why they were here. If they were done eating, then they needed to perform. These words made everyone shudder, and they hurried to get ready to continue their journey. The man with the beard moved forward. Noishe, sitting next to Ravi, was upset by this situation. Douglas, with the baby on his back, walked behind everyone. Suddenly, one of the adventurers told everyone to gather. They found animal tracks. They were just huge. Red-eyed dragons have a habit of stealing nests from other species. There is a good chance that the dragon started making a nest at the end of these tracks. It must have been true considering their size. They were lucky this year, and everyone agreed with this statement. Douglas also found more tracks. Others said that they needed to hurry, but the magician said that they should abandon this path. Everyone looked at him with incomprehension, and he, sitting down on the ground, said to look at the other tracks. The bearded man answered him that these were just tracks of a deer or a boar. If he interfered, he would send him flying. He said that if it was a deer, there would be no hoof prints, but if it was a boar, there would be more prints. One part of the front was the shape of the main hoof, indicating a rounded creature. This feature means that the tracks belong to the mythical beast unicorn. Everyone around screamed. The mythical beast is unlikely to be seen once, but then why can't they go that way? They think that unicorns are very cautious, so if you don't get too close, they won't attack people. But the problem was not the unicorn itself. The problem was that the unicorn, who should have been very careful, was in such a panic that he forgot to erase his tracks. The only possibility of such a circumstance for them, it's when they run away from a huge monster that eats even mythical beasts. But they've never heard of anything like that. It's only because they don't know. It's hard to believe, of course. But he asks them all to go back today. They'll be at a disadvantage against some huge, unknown monster. Even in such extremely rare cases, there was a good chance of dying. It would be too late if they had sustained serious injuries. The bearded man was shouting again that his chatter was annoying as hell, and they needed to get a grip. Are they all such fools? After all, Douglas was just a coward when he got here. After all, he would be ashamed to run alone. So his plan is to try to take them all with him. The man moved forward, continuing to say that all the girls who wanted to run away could feel free to leave. He would not communicate with such cowards. The others shouted to wait for them and move forward after him. The young man with the bandaged head said that he was sorry. Although the two of them, father and daughter, would be left alone. They had to go back. But the magician said that they would go too. He would never leave them just like that. The young guy said that he was also a father, although very different from their bearded man. Douglas asked if the other guys with the leader were sons and father, but he's not their real father. This bearded guy has never been married, but the other guys owe him because he saved their lives or something. So even if they're scared, they'll follow him like a father. However, despite the fact that he's been serving in the self-defense forces for several years, he can't stand this man. He thinks that he can already resign. That's how things were. Noyce may know that this leader is difficult to deal with because of his arrogance. But if he says that the leader is like a father to them, then that's a different story. He understands, because now he has something to protect too. I'm sure that this leader is just worried about them. He followed Noyce, saying that today was the first time he met their leader. But he thinks that he is just clumsy compared to the others. Even during lunch break, he looked like he was the only one watching their surroundings. And when he said there was danger, he was the first to rush into the mountains. He may be scary, but he wants them to understand that it doesn't mean he hates them all. He believes that he did it so that the guys wouldn't get hurt. If this is so, then Noju is just some kind of dead weight that can't even suffer. But he asked his uncle what he thinks. Is he the same girl? He spoke, but the magician did not understand at all what he meant. Sounds were heard from the side. They ran towards them. The soldiers were scared. They asked what happened. Douglas closed the rabbi's eyes, telling him not to look. They realized that there were a lot of red-eyed dragon remains around. There's so much blood that it seems like they could have just been eaten, but red-eyed dragons are beasts of a complex rank. Could a creature have found one that devours them? He is right that such a creature would be near a city that does not have a dungeon nearby. This is extremely strange. This red coal is also used to mask smells, and the bloodstains there indicate a tail. Finally, it seems he realized what was happening. A huge monster with a dragon in its mouth was flying right at them in the air. It was a demonic black dragon, an SS-ranked dragon king capable of destroying a village in an hour, and it was devouring red-eyed dragons. The adventurers panicked. It was hopeless for them to defeat such a creature. They moved forward screaming, running away. They tried to stop them because the demonic black dragon tends to attack those who run away first. He shouted at them not to run but to hide. They seemed not to hear him because of the dragon. It attacked them. The hero dodged and asked Ravi if she and the other guys who were okay. They were lying on the ground alive because the bearded man was able to block part of the blow. He asked the guys if they were all okay. They were okay, and now they could retreat and forget about their luggage. Douglas saw that the chief's leg was wounded, and he said so. But the bearded man said that they had no time to chat. So there was no time to pay attention to the wound either. The bearded man said that he would be bait, and the others had to run. Noish asked him to stop, because it was absurd, but he did not listen. It was impossible to outrun the dragon on foot, especially with such wounds. Douglas would never send him to his death. He asked Ravi to hold on tight and began to chant the spell for acceleration, saying to ignite at full power explosive acceleration. Ravi screamed from the speed. The others were shocked by the acceleration of magic. Could it be that this old man was actually some kind of magician of an incomprehensible level? Noish gritted his teeth. Approaching the bearded man, he saw that the dragon was about to attack with fire and shouted to jump to the side and do it quickly. The bearded man listened to him. He simply couldn't take his eyes off his prey. He cast the spell again, this time asking for the ascending flight to ignite at full power. And at the moment the dragon released the fire, he jumped into the air. He avoided the black demonic dragon's strike. He needs to aim for the weak spot on its throat, the scales underneath. However, this area is difficult. If they stay in the air here, he will be hit too. A young guy with a bandage was running towards them. He was helping the bearded man up, shouting at him to hurry up. The man called him a lousy boy. Noish thought he had been relying on the man the entire time he was part of the self-defense force. However, that was not the case at all. Seeing their old men in action had also ignited a desire to act. He had always wanted to be the one to save him. The man heard his words and simply accepted the help silently. Douglas continued to dodge the dragon while in the air. The guy shouted at his uncle to give it his all, and Ravi supported him in this. He told the others to leave it to him. He decided that with magic, he would disperse the flames with wind magic and do it by using both hell ice and flight magic skills at the same time. And the blow was able to knock down the dragon. When he was finished, everyone gathered together again and asked him for forgiveness. Believe the bearded man in his words, he would not have put everyone in danger. He is sincerely sorry. The magician said that everything is fine and he needs to raise his head. The rest supported their leader. No one was hurt, so you need to raise your head, especially since he was injured. Douglas crouched down, asking to show his leg using the skills he would help him. The others shouted to the leaders to get up quickly, because he had to show his leg to the doctor. He called out to Noish and replied that if he could not get up, he would lend him his shoulder again. Others encouraged him by saying that they would then carry Noosh's things, but they turned out to be heavy and loaded to the brim. He was also entrusted with the leader's things, but they were even heavier than the leader's. Since they were done here, they needed to hurry up and go back. They also needed to reroute the mayor's office about the demonic black dragon. That was understandable, of course, but what would they do with this dragon? They couldn't just leave it here. On the other hand, they couldn't butcher it with their current equipment. At this point, the mage lifted the dragon's corpse up with wind magic. The dragon's center of gravity is concentrated in its belly. Holding it with wind magic, you can lift it. Of course, provided that it does not move. The others were simply delighted with the old man. The leader asked them who this old man was. Noish replied that he did not know, but was clearly a powerful adventurer with a child, after defeating the demonic black dragon and returning to the city. The people around gathered around the corpse of the dragon in the center of the city. The man sincerely appreciates their efforts during this pacification. To think that a black demonic dragon would appear. If the humans hadn't dealt with it, the entire city might have been wiped off the face of the earth right now. He asked to be allowed to express gratitude on behalf of the city. He said to give the reward to the commander of the self-defense forces. There were a lot of them. In addition to the reward for subduing the red-eyed dragons, he also included the reward for subduing the black demon dragon. He wanted to offer a bigger reward, but for some reason it didn't work out. Thinking about it, the bearded man told Douglas that all this gold was his. After all, it was he who defeated the demonic black dragon. The rest were in complete agreement, so they decided to do so while he was in the vision. Only he waved his hand, saying that he couldn't accept it. Although he had pacified him, he became an attacker by chance. He only succeeded because the other guys took on the role of a tank. The man refused to be a tank. It wasn't that hard. They were just attacked. But when he encountered the dragon, he had no intention of fighting alone. Just because the guys were there, he figured out a way to defeat it. He suggested dividing everything equally. After all, they had clung to this victory together. The bearded man said that he was quite honest. The others laughed. The man who entered the room was clearly amazed. He said that it seemed that Douglas was indeed an unpredictable and soft-hearted person. It turned out that this man was the guildmaster of Addington. Right after the orphanage incident, he found out about it out of pure interest. Just when he was wondering what rank he was at, he found out that his license was revoked. It turned out to be true, but the question is why a person like him is doing this again. He didn't really hide it, but to make it all so clear, we need to start with why the guildmaster suddenly became interested in this. The master asked not to misunderstand him. This cold manner of speaking is simply his bad habit. He did not ridicule the magician. Rather, he personally did not understand the point of revoking the license of a warrior who can defeat even a black dragon. So he tried to make inquiries at the Balzac Guild. But it can't be that the reason is that he lacks strength. In other words, what he wants to say is this. The guild in Addington wants to issue him an application for a new license. He was surprised by this. Issuing a license, will he really become an adventurer again? They will do it as a token of gratitude for saving this village. This is the best he can do as a guild master. Will he accept his offer? Everyone was shocked by the personal invitation from the guild master. It was the first time they had seen something like this. Had he really already passed the entrance exam? But he said he would take it again. Others thought it was cruel. However, he is so adored even though they have only just met him. He also has leadership qualities, but given the current situation, he really does not understand the Balzac Guild's answer. If the magician wants, he can send a request for investigation to the investigative committee. But he asked to wait a minute with this. After all, the guild's decision was not a mistake. At that time, he was definitely a dead weight who could not handle any task. But he was originally a top officer. But it turned out that everything went downhill. But even if he didn't understand it, it's not natural. Even if he's injured or sick, as long as there's hope for recovery, his license is simply temporarily suspended. It seemed that he had to tell them after all. The whole truth was that he was cursed. Everyone understood that it must have been terrible for him. The master asked for forgiveness, saying that he would no longer poke his nose into other people's business. But other than that, there's nothing to worry about. Even with that said, he'll work with him to get a new license. They need to do it as soon as possible. Norisha was standing next to him, said that it was probably a complete relief for him. After all, he had to go through a lot, but now he could return to his previous life. The magician recalled the past moments of his life. His old life didn't seem rosy. It seemed like he couldn't get his license back. So why isn't he happy? Now that his powers are back, he can say goodbye to this lifestyle of working day jobs. But the current him, to tell the truth, is not very happy about it. He looked at Ravi standing next to him. The master was already saying that in this case it was necessary to draw up a document in his guild. But Douglas said that he was still thinking of giving up this matter. Everyone turned around, not understanding why he was refusing. His financial situation would change significantly if he had a license. He himself understood that. But even so, at least he doesn't have the feeling that he wants to return the license right now. He's very grateful for their concern, but asks for forgiveness. The master sighed and said that he was very sorry, but it would be wrong of him to force him. However, it sounds pretty cool to have the strongest traveler who is not part of the guild, and also a guardian. The bearded man joyfully began to shout that since everything had been decided, they needed to bring drinks and celebrate today. The others tried to dissuade him because they were in the mayor's office after all. For a moment, he thought he didn't want to become an adventurer again because he was accompanying Ravi, that he needed to prioritize in order to repay the debt for helping him get rid of the curse. However, that was not all. Meeting people in an unfamiliar village and having fun together like that was an unimaginable reality at that time. He finds his current lifestyle quite exciting. 4 days later, he received permission to travel from the military police, who said that Matlock and his men would soon be transferred to the prison in the royal capital. The raw materials from the demonic black dragon, or rather the spoils, were divided with the self-defense forces. As for his share, he left part for travel expenses to Balzac and donated the rest to the orphanage. By the way, the Matlock orphanage was renamed Addington, and it looks like it is now run by the townspeople. One can only hope that the children who remain there will be able to live happily. Ravi was dressed in more expensive and beautiful clothes. She looked charming in them. However, he apologized for saying this, but would this coat really suit her? There is a nicer option. You need to look at them. But the girl liked it better like her dad's. They walked further through the city. All that was left in that city was just a couple of points. They were called out by an old man, Theo, asking if they were already leaving this city. It was very timely. He was just thinking about his story. It was about the necklace. But did he want to sell it again now? Although he did not understand how such a rare accessory came to him. He said that when he removed the spell, it fell next to him. Even he did not know all the details. T.E.O., hearing about this, shouted that it was a dark item. He would never buy it. The surprised magician said that he had broken the curse, so there should be no problems with the accessory. He sighed. Even if it were true, he would still feel uneasy about all of this. He was a good guy, but his lack of tact was a problem. He was shocked why. If anything, they don't really know each other, but he knows a collector who collects items related to curses, and his name is Baron Morse, a wealthy man living in the pleasure city of Milton. Knowing him, he will agree to any price and he should visit him. He thanked, saying that he is indebted to the old man. But for him, this customer service is the duty of the merchant, because then the buyer will spend money with him again. He noticed sounds from the side. A huge crowd of residents stood around him. He didn't understand why. One of the people moved forward, saying that there were rumors about an adventurer with a child. He asked if he was one. It turned out that he caught the director trading and then killed a giant dragon the whole city is talking about. These rumors about him realizing that he is the truth that guy, they were glad that he solved the crime. If he had not visited them there, would have been more victims. They called him Addington's hero. The boy denied it, saying he did what he could. For others, his modesty was also beautiful. He hugged Ravi to himself, saying, "Hold on tight." The crowd was closing in on them. Someone from the side shouted at Douglas that he could not cope with the large crowd and that he was being extolled. These were adventurers. They stood around them, pushing the crowd back. He asked them what they were doing here. Of course, they came to see him off and want to protect this hero. They don't want his memory of this city to be ruined. They thanked Douglas that they would try to put in a little more effort here and wished him to stay strong and visit the city again someday. The magician, smiling, waved goodbye with his daughter. For the first time, he leaves like this. Not sure if he will be able to meet them again. Even so, he will never forget them. He is really glad that he could meet them in this city. He shouted after them that he is indebted to them and they should all stay healthy too. Douglas and Ravi sat on the stone bank of a small river, a backpack lying next to them. Douglas reflected that 2 days had passed since they left Addington. Their journey south continued. Douglas rubbed his chin with his hand, and he watched Ravi drink from his flask. He considered that their destination was the city of pleasures, Milton. Douglas looked thoughtfully ahead. Douglas was on one knee and asked Ravi without turning to face her if she liked to fish. She looked at him and said yes, she liked fish. A small spotted fish was swimming in the river in front of him. Douglas stood up on both feet and said that was great. Then they should catch and cook some fish for dinner. Ravi was squatting, wondering how Douglas was going to catch the fish. Douglas touched his chin with his hand and said that he could use his skills. Ravi should help him today. Ravi looked at Douglas and agreed to help him. There was cloth and rope on the ground. Douglas said that they had collected everything they needed: chocolate vine ivy, a jute bag, and 3 branches that Ravi had brought. Ravi stood next to him and held the branches in her hands. Douglas started making and said that first you need to connect the branches. Then attach a jute bag to them, and thus you will get a fishing net. Douglas raised the net up. Robbie raised her hands up in happiness. Douglas and Ravi went into the hand. It was not deep. The water was knee-deep for Ravi. Douglas said that Ravi needed to drive the fish to him. She did not understand how she should do it. Douglas held the net in his hands and turned to Ravi. He said that she should figure out how to do it herself. He would dry her clothes later. She did not need to restrain herself. Rocky stood nearby. She bent down to the water. Ravi put her hands in the water. The fish appeared in front of her. Ravi's face changed. She was surprised. Her mouth dropped open. Douglas still had the net in his hands and told Ravi to do something different. They were standing a short distance apart in the river. Ravi was splashing in the water. Douglas was surprised by what he saw. Douglas stood with his net in the water, the fish swimming towards him. One fish jumped into the air and landed above Douglas's net. Ravi screamed with happiness and raises his hands up. Two fish were being skewered on shelves and were cooking over an open fire. Ravi picks up one of the fish and starts eating. She takes the first bite and says the fish is delicious. Douglas looks at her and says she should be careful with the bones. Douglas starts eating the fish too. He looks at the sizzling fish and thinks he added salt as a seasoning. The silver cherry trout this season is clean and soft. Its flesh is fluffy and tender. Douglas and Ravi were sitting next to the fire, eating dinner. Douglas asked Ravi if they had done a good job today. Ravi agreed. The fire was growing and crackling next to them. Douglas looked ahead and thought. Ravi was putting on her jacket and said that she thought it would rain today. Douglas and Ravi were surrounded by fields and mountains with clouds floating above them. Douglas asked Ravi what magic she had used to figure this out. Ravi replied that she could read the weather. Douglas was surprised by her answer. Douglas called Ravi to him. He pointed his finger upwards. Ravi crouched down and watched where Douglas was pointing. Clouds were floating across the sky. Douglas said that they were called cumulonimbus. Rain falls from them for a short time. Ravi looked up, fascinated. A drop of water fell on Ravi's head. Douglas said that earlier there was more water in the stream than usual, but it was probably too early for a sudden change in the weather. Ravi and Douglas, who were sitting on the ground, were hit by a torrential rain. They were in shock at what was happening. Douglas and Ravi are wearing raincoats and walking along the road, surrounded by fields and mountains and pouring rain. Douglas holds Ravi in his arms and says that this is all too ironic, and that Ravi needs to be patient a little longer. Douglas looks at Ravi and thinks that he is glad that he bought Ravi a coat. The nearest town is at least half a day's walk away. Douglas says they need to find a place to rest. In front of them is a small, horse-drawn cart. There are a lot of things in the cart. A man is sitting in it, and another one is trying to push the stuck cart out. The pouring rain continued to fall. Douglas looks ahead and thinks that most likely the cart is stuck in this rain, so the strangers cannot get out. Ravi is still in his arms. Douglas, with Ravi in his arms, approaches the cart with the strangers and offers them his help. The stranger pulls out his arrows, and at the same moment Douglas takes a defensive position. The stranger armed himself with a bow. Behind him stood a cart. In front of him stood Douglas, in a fighting pose. The stranger said that he apologized, but he would not accept help from a man, and warned that Douglas and Ravi had better leave quickly. In the cart was a child in a cloak who said the word, people. Douglas looked at the strangers in surprise and thought that in front of him was an elf father and his child. Douglas remembers the dense forest and thinks that he heard about elves who never leave the forest where they were born. Outside the forest you can hardly meet them. They're of a different race and cautious. They seem arrogant towards humans. Douglas hid Ravi behind his back. The elf held the bow in front of him. Douglas broke the silence and said that he apologized for scaring the strangers. He was just passing by and decided to offer his help again. The elf, armed with a bow, remains silent. Douglas takes off his hood and says that he does the same when he is worried, especially since he also has a child, and a stranger can count on him. Ravi stood silently nearby. The elf and his child continued to look at Douglas and Ravi tensely, but the elf gave in and lowered his bow. He thanked Douglas for his help. Douglas walked up to the cart, put his backpack on the ground, and took off his cloak. The elf said that the load in the cart was heavy and they couldn't lift the cart together. Douglas said that everyone needed to step back a little. The elf child said that, "Father, could these people be trusted?" The elf interrupted him and said that he should be more polite. Douglas took hold of the cart with his hands. Someone said a spell, ignite at full power. The elves were surprised. At that moment, Douglas's muscles bulged in size. He clenched his teeth, and steam came out of his mouth. Douglas began to move the cart, from which things began to fall out. Ravi and the two elves stood behind. Ravi raised her hands. She was shocked. Two elves watched with admiration. After a few meters, Douglas stopped the cart. Even the horses were surprised by what was happening. The elf's child asked with admiration how this happened. The elf took Douglas's things and said that they were grateful to him. Douglas was their savior. Douglas turned and said that they should not worry, he was glad to help them. The elf handed Douglas's things and said that he apologized for his rudeness. His name was Louis, and his son Nicky was with him. Nicky stood behind her father and looked at Douglas with admiration. Nicky climbed into the cart. Ravi reached for Douglas. Louis stood with things in his hands. He said that in honor of gratitude he could give them a few things. Douglas thanked Louis for the things and asked him to wait out the rain with them. Louis looked at Douglas and said that Douglas and Ravi could stay with them and that the elves were very careful, but that did not mean they were ungrateful. Douglas touched Ravi's hood and said that he accepted Louis' suggestion. Nicky climbed out of the cart towards Ravi and grabbed her sleeve. He shouted that the children were sitting in the back, so Ravi would go with him. Ravi and Douglas were frightened by such an unexpected appearance of Nicky. Ravi rips his sleeve out of Nicky's hand. Nicky and Douglas look at her in surprise. Ravi looks at Nicky, who instantly blushes and shouts that he was just thinking of giving her his hand. Louis carries the things to the cart and says that Douglas has a cute daughter. Douglas lifts Ravi and looks at Louis in surprise and agrees with his words. The cart starts moving. Nicky sat on the wooden boxes in the wagon and said that Ravi's father was amazing. He was wondering how Douglas was able to move the wagon. Louis and Douglas sat at the front of the wagon. Ravi continued to agree and nod in confusion. Douglas thoughtfully watched her actions. Douglas, sitting next to Louis, began to smile and thought that he was not very good at talking to Ravi. She was alone in the shelter. Perhaps she was still embarrassed around children her age. The horses continued to walk. Douglas reflected that he himself was weak in socialization, so he understood her difficulties. Also, her own character influenced. So it was a difficult problem. Douglas put his hand to his chin and thought it would be nice if Ravi found some friends. Louis said with a smile that they had arrived. Ravi and Douglas raised their heads and looked up in surprise. There were small buildings on the trees. This place was the Elven Village, Floria. The boys stopped the cart and went to one of the tree houses. Ravi was drying her hair with a towel. Douglas was sitting next to her and folding things. A woman with a drawing on her face came up to them and said that her husband told her about them. She was grateful to them for helping her during the rain. The woman took Douglas's things and said that Douglas and Ravi should stay with them for the night to wait out the rain. Douglas said no. At that moment, someone enters the room and starts casting a spell. A bright flash illuminated Douglas and Ravi. They looked in surprise in the direction from which the light came. Douglas thought that it was wind magic, with the help of which their clothes were drying. Louis hugged his wife, and Nicky stood next to them, smiling. Louis cast a spell and said that Douglas should not be modest. Douglas and Ravi watched, fascinated. Douglas got up from the floor and said that they were ready to stay the night if there was anything he could do to help Louis. Ravi sat next to him and looked at Douglas. Plates of food were on the table where everyone gathered. Louis said that they rarely left the village and only to go shopping. There were many dangers and monsters around. Nicky brought a book and asked Douglas if he had seen mermaids. Douglas recalled what mermaids looked like and said that in the southern seas there was a pirate lot led by mermaids. He once fought with them, although they were enemies. But their singing was enchanting. Nicky excitedly asked Douglas if he had seen any dragons. Douglas looked at Nicky and said he had only recently come across them. Nicky asked Ravi if she had seen any dragons. She stood still. Nicky continued to hold the book. The rain continued to fall. Nick's excited cries continued to be heard from the treehouse. But one of the relatives threatened him that if he wanted to talk, he should sit down and ask about everything. Louis's wife was washing dishes in a basin with magic. Douglas was sitting and rummaging through things. There were large vases next to him. An elderly elf was nearby. He had thick and long eyebrows as well as a beard. Douglas turned around when Louis began to tell him that Thanks to him, Louis had gained valuable experience today. Louis sat down next to Douglas, holding 2 cups and a jug. He said that this was the first time he had communicated with someone of another race, perhaps elves, at a loss for life in his own little world. Douglas reached out to take the cup. Louis pours Douglas a cup and says that Douglas probably thinks that elves don't open their hearts to other races. Douglas gets nervous. Douglas droops. He thinks that he has made a mistake and he is bad at such conversations. In front of Douglas and Louis sit Nikki and Ravi. They are watching the children. One of them casts a spell. Nikki smiled and said that the magic of light is radiance. He raised his finger up and a ball of light appeared above the guys. Ravi watched the ball in surprise. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The ball fell in front of Douglas and Louis. Douglas's mouth dropped open in surprise. He thought he knew that elves specialized in magical skills for everyday work, but to learn at such a young age was amazing. Ravi turned to Douglas and said, "Dad, could she do the same if she practiced magic?" Douglas was surprised that Ravi wanted to learn some skills too. Ravi smiled and agreed with him. Nikki laughed and said that he would personally teach Ravi. Nikki raised his hands in front of him, and a light appeared between his palms. He said that Ravi should remember the spell that he said, then concentrate the power in his palms. Douglas and Lou listened to the children's conversations with a smile. Nikki said to squeeze hard. Ravi should try to chant once with him. Nikki and Ravi were kneeling and chanting the spell together. Ravi held her hands in front of her and repeated the spell, and a light shone between her palms. Then, everything went dark. Ravi was kneeling. Nikki was kneeling in front of her. Adults were sitting nearby and watching. Ravi said sadly that she couldn't. Douglas stood up to address Ravi, but Louis stopped him. With his other hand, he brought to his face and made a gesture of silence. Douglas looked nervously at Louis. Nikki said that Ravi shouldn't worry. It won't work right away. Nikki started smiling widely and said that even he took a month to do it. But if Ravi really wanted to learn, he would take care of it while she was in this place. Ravi looked at Nikki in surprise. Louis put his cup to his lips. Douglas looked away nervously. Then he smiled and scratched his head. He thought that it was not easy for him either, since he did not have the knowledge on how to learn his first skill. Douglas wondered why Ravi wanted to learn the skills. Ravi was kneeling and looking at Douglas. Nikki was standing next to her. Nikki looked at Ravi and exclaimed that since she was here, they should ask Grandpa to test her aptitude for skills. Ravi was embarrassed. Louis and Douglas were surprised to hear this. Nikki stood up and said that ability depends on the talent one is born with. If there is no predisposition, then everything will be useless no matter how much practice. Tears appeared in Ravi's eyes. Douglas was in a panic. He didn't know what to do. Louis praised Nikki. Nikki led his grandfather by the hand. He said that it was better to know the predisposition now than to cry later. Ravi sat on her knees and shook. Grandpa Nikki didn't understand what was wanted from him. Nikki said that he needed to test Ravi's aptitude for a skill. Grandpa Nikki opened his eyes. Ravi and Douglas looked at the old man with horror. Grandfather sat down opposite Ravi. The others stood nearby and watched. Douglas was nervous and thought that Nikki was right, that the potential of skills is determined at birth and never changes during life. Grandfather looked closely at Ravi. She was nervous, and beads of sweat were running down her face. Grandpa continued to sit opposite Ravi. He said that there were some abilities. Nikki stood next to him. Then Grandma came up, holding a blanket in her hands. Douglas and Louis were nervous. Ravi raised her hands and called Douglas. He was watching the situation nervously. Ravi said through tears that she wanted to learn the skills. Douglas nervously replied that he knew it. Nikki offered to show Ravi some skills as an example. Louis said that skills are best learned by seeing and feeling the process. Douglas jumped in and said that Louis was definitely right. Douglas raised his hands in front of him and said that Ravi should watch carefully. He cast a spell. A clot of light appeared in his hands. Douglas became nervous and thought that he had miscalculated the amount of energy. Douglas was kneeling with Ravi and the others in front of him. The entire room was illuminated by a bright flash of light. The room went dark. Ravi was kneeling, disoriented by the light that blinded her. Douglas nervously asked her for forgiveness. Grandpa woke up and shouted that it was morning. Douglas nervously apologized for what he had done. The others were also blinded. Louis rubbed his eyes. He was surprised and said that What a heavenly light! Ravi stood next to Douglas. Louis said that such a bright glow from a simple light skill. What is Douglas? Nikki said that Douglas is very cool. There was a flash behind Douglas and Ravi. A bright light illuminated everything around. Everyone around was confused and scared. Then a loud noise was heard. Douglas hugged Ravi and said it was lightning. Like trees had fallen. Were the boys okay? Louis agreed with Douglas and said he hoped they hadn't fallen on anyone's house. Douglas nervously asked if there was no lightning rod in the village. Louis replied that there was no lightning rod. They did not use things made by other races. Elves held festivals to ward off lightning. Douglas thought that this was an elven custom. He was an outsider in this place and he should not interfere with it. Everyone gathered in the center of the house. Another elf runs into Louis' house and shouts that something bad has happened. Lightning has caused a fire in Moreau's house. Attempts to put it out have failed. The fire is out of control. Everything could burn down. Louis, Douglas, and Ravi listen to the story with horror. Douglas and Ravi stand motionless in shock. They see a big fire and think that at this rate the whole forest will turn into flames. Douglas goes to the front door where Louis is standing and says he will go and maybe help with something. Douglas then goes to Ravi and calls her. Louis opens the door where the elf is standing. Douglas looks towards the door. The elf stands in the rain and starts pointing. He said, "Why?" "There's a man here." Douglas looked away without saying a word. Douglas picked up Ravi and started climbing out the window. He said he apologized to Louis, but he would go first. Louis was worried about Douglas's thoughtless act. Douglas climbed onto the window. Holding Ravi in his arms, he said that everything was fine. Then he cast a spell. Douglas cast another spell, and together with Ravi began to fly in the opposite direction from Louis' house. Louis stood and looked out the open window. He was surprised by Douglas's abilities. The night was dark. The rain was still pouring down. One of the elven villagers was on his knees, begging for help. The man screamed that his wife and child were buried under debris. The woman and child were covered with pieces of trees that were engulfed in flames. The woman was hugging her child and was still under the rubble. The rest of the villagers raised their hands and tried to put out the fire with magic. But the fire did not stop. It was getting stronger. An elderly villager said that at this rate the forest would burn to the ground. All the trees in the area had to be cut down. Douglas shouted that everyone had to go away. He would put out the fire. The villagers were shocked by what they heard. Douglas landed next to the villagers, holding Ravi in his arms, holding her cloak. The residents were shocked. They were all interested in the question of why there was a man in this forest. Douglas began to cast a spell, from which a large cloud of water appeared. Douglas continued to chant. The cloud of water grew larger and larger. A huge water ball appeared above Douglas and the villagers. The villagers were perplexed by what was happening. Douglas held Ravi with one hand and waved his other hand towards the open fire, water pouring onto the fire. The rain continued to fall, and one of the villagers said that the flames were still burning. Douglas approached him and said that he knew that the elves were a cautious race, and if they did not want them in the forest, they could leave now. Douglas held Ravi in his arms and said that putting out the fire came first. He wanted to save those who were suffering. The villagers, young and old, looked at Douglas and Ravi warily. An elderly villager raised his hand and said that he understood the people's concerns, but now it was necessary to work together with the man. Douglas smiled silently. Louis and his wife approached him from behind. Louis and his wife were worried about Ravi. Douglas let her go to the ground, but she continued to cling to Douglas's pant leg. Douglas looked at Ravi. She said that he should be careful. Douglas smiled at what Ravi said. He said that she should rely on him. Some villagers were casting spells. Others were helping the wounded in the fire. Douglas lifted a piece of fallen wood and helped free the wounded from the trap. Douglas held the stone in his hands and turned around when he heard one of the villagers calling for help. Douglas saw several men holding a huge tree, under the rubble of which were other villagers calling for help. Douglas ran to a large fallen tree and said that everyone needed to move away. He would help them. One of the villagers said how Douglas was going to help them. Douglas grabbed the tree with his hands. Douglas cast a spell and lifted a huge piece of wood above him. The rest of the villagers stood in shock and watched. Douglas held the tree above him and heard one of the villagers say that he was some kind of monster. The rain continued to fall. Douglas and the other villagers continued to clear the rubble. The woman and child lay motionless. Her husband was kneeling nearby. He was in a panic. One of the elves was shouting that the wounds were very dangerous. They needed to call a doctor. Douglas came up to them and said that there was no need to call a doctor. Come up to them and said that there was no need to call a doctor. Douglas extended his hand forward and began to cast a spell. A glowing dome of magic appeared above the woman and the child. The other elves watched what was happening. The woman hugged her child and opened her eyes. Douglas continued to cast a spell and said that the wound should heal now. The elf man hugged his wife and child. He began to cry bitterly. Douglas stood next to him and looked towards the reunited family. Douglas stepped aside. The rain had almost stopped. He thought that the fire had been put out. He and Ravi had caused a big fuss in the village, as they were not supposed to be here. Douglas walked through the rubble. He smiled and thought that he felt sorry for Louis and the rest of the inhabitants. But he and Ravi had to continue their journey to another city. At that moment, someone called out to Douglas. He turned to the call. Douglas turned to see the entire village on their knees, thanking him. Rafi stood nearby with her wife Louis in her arms and watched what was happening. The next day came. Douglas looked out the window and thought it was good that the weather had cleared. But the damage from the previous night was enormous. The villagers continued to clear the rubble of collapsed houses. Douglas turned to Louis and said that they were willing to help remove everything if it didn't bother anyone, and then they were ready to go. Louis replied that they would all be glad to help. Douglas leaned over to Ravi and asked what she was doing there. Ravi doesn't have time to answer. Nikki's scream is heard immediately. He said that if Ravi goes to help everyone, he will go with her. Louis stood nearby and refused his son's offer. Ravi stood silently. Nikki was unhappy that Louis perceives him as a child. Ravi told Douglas that she would also stand in the house with Nikki. Douglas stood up and thought that the children would be better off together than with the adults. Douglas and Louis came to the villagers. One of the residents greeted them and called Douglas a strong man. Douglas was surprised. He was surrounded by villagers. They began to thank him for his help and shake his hand. Douglas was confused and said that he was glad to help. Douglas stood there looking confused, and one of the young villagers said that they needed to show Douglas their team spirit. The villagers picked up a large tree and began to move it. Douglas was shocked by what was happening. Douglas thoughtfully rubbed his chin with his hand. Louis stood next to him and said that the residents had more strength than usual. This was thanks to Douglas's support. The residents admired him. Douglas was surprised by Louis's words. Louis said that the elf race is still weak. Douglas looked towards the tree, where the girls were standing and watching him. Douglas looked at the girls and blushed with embarrassment. The whole village heard the cry of one of the residents, who said that it was time for harvesting. After some time, it got dark. The bell rang. Douglas and Louis entered Louis's house, where his wife was waiting for them. Douglas thought that the cleaning work was not finished yet, and there were no elves in this forest who could possess a muscle-strengthening buff. He wanted to help them with the fallen big tree. Ravi came running to Douglas. She was glad to see him back. Louis's wife held a tray in her hands and said that Ravi never stopped practicing magic. Nikki continued smiling that he acted like a teacher. He gave Ravi intensive training. Ravi smiled and said she still couldn't do it. Douglas continued to look at her. Douglas approached Ravi and asked if she was okay. Nikki stood next to them. Douglas thought nervously that Ravi always smiled when she was happy. It was as if she was forcing herself to smile. Douglas stroked Ravi's face and said that he would quickly look at her status. Douglas held his hand in front of Ravi's face and magical symbols appeared in front of him. Douglas read a spell to himself. Ravi's hair flew in different directions. Various symbols appeared in front of Douglas, and then her status. She had a cold. Douglas took Ravi by the shoulders and shouted nervously that she had a cold and was tired. The elves suggested calling a doctor. Ravi continued to stand silently. A slight blush appeared on her face. Ravi lay in bed, covered with a blanket, with Douglas sitting next to her and watching her. He thought that he should have noticed the painful condition earlier. His healing skill only works on physical wounds. It is not suitable for treating diseases. Ravi lay on the pillow. Her cheeks flushed. Douglas thought that due to overexertion during the practice of magic, she had exhausted herself. Douglas sat next to her and did not understand why Ravi continued to practice so persistently. Douglas sat above the tree that ran through the house. Ravi said that she was asking for her forgiveness because she kept causing trouble. Douglas was surprised by her words. Ravi opened her eyes and said that she wanted to be with Douglas. Dad took her wherever he went. But because Mr. Beard and everyone else were mad at them, Douglas remembered the angry faces of the people. Douglas stood up and Ravi continued to say that she was a burden who could do nothing. She wanted to learn magic so she wouldn't cause trouble while she was with Douglas. Ravi was crying and asking for forgiveness. Douglas looked at Ravi and thought that now he understood why Ravi was constantly trying to master the skills. Douglas put his hand on Ravi's bed and said that he never considered her a burden. Douglas thought and remembered Ravi's face. He thought that no matter how much he said, she would not be able to forgive herself. Even during the morning conversation, she stayed home not because of Nika, but because of the words about the inability of children to help adults. Douglas recalled the difficulties that awaited them on the way, and thought that the idea of taking Ravi on the hike was not the best one, because of the troubles they got into, thus making her worry. Douglas sat next to the bed and wiped the tears from Ravi's face. He said that whenever they find themselves in a difficult situation, he will consider independent actions, but he will not make decisions, just like Ravi. Douglas looked at Ravi and continued to say that they would discuss the next course of action together. Ravi smiled and said that she agreed with Douglas, but she would still try not to be a burden. Douglas squatted next to the bed and said that she was not a burden, but he understood her feelings. She needed to control herself so that he would not worry about her anymore. Ravi smiled and agreed with Douglas. Louis came into the room and said that the doctor would be there soon. Douglas thanked him and looked at Ravi again. Douglas stood up and said that if Ravi wanted to eat, he would cook for her. She replied that she wanted the soup that Douglas had cooked on the first day they met. Douglas replied that he would prepare it right away. He left the room and found himself on the stairs. Louis's wife handed Douglas a tray of food and told him that Douglas should take it to Ravi. Douglas smiled at the cuteness of the food that looked like baby rabbits. Douglas took the tray and asked how she managed to cut the food like that and if she could teach him. The woman laughed and said that Douglas was a good father. Douglas thought about her words. Louis's wife went on to say that she was surprised when Douglas noticed the change in Ravi's condition. The responsibilities of raising a child are not easy to cope with. Douglas responded that he is not coping very well yet. Ravi's soup was cooking, and Louis's wife was teaching Douglas how to properly cut rabbits out of fruit. Douglas managed to cut several rabbits onto a tray. Ravi was eating sap. Douglas asked her if she wanted to eat anything else. He brought apples for her, which Louis's wife helped him cut. Ravi was amazed and delighted. Douglas held out a tray of sliced fruit to her. Douglas held the tray. Ravi said she liked the rabbits in the back. Douglas nervously said he wasn't the one who cut them up very well. Ravi smiled and held a sliced fruit in her hands. There was a bowl of soup next to her. Ravi said that she liked this rabbit better. Tears of happiness appeared in Douglas's eyes. Douglas and Ravi took advantage of the goodwill of Louis and the other villagers, and stayed in the village for a while until Ravi recovered. During this time, Douglas helped the villagers with cleaning. On the day they were about to leave the village, Nika's grandfather sat across from Ravi and tested her abilities again. The others sat nearby and watched. Grandfather held his hand out in front of Ravi's face and said he saw something. Grandpa continued to say that Ravi should not worry. She has a talent for learning skills. Ravi and Douglas beamed with happiness. Grandpa continued to say that Ravi must work hard to awaken this power. Ravi and Douglas sat in front of their grandfather and listened to what he would say. He said that Ravi's skill potential was 5.120 tenths. Douglas was delighted and surprised. Ravi did not understand what these numbers meant. Douglas said that the average potential of a person that he can use is 3. If the value is 0, then there is no predisposition to skills, and the higher the potential, the easier it is to master complex skills. Ravi asked what Douglas's skill potential was. He replied that it was equal to 900. Louis was shocked by Douglas's answer. He did not believe that with such a small potential, such powerful spells could be used. Grandfather offered to test Douglas's potential. He agreed. Grandpa tested Douglas's potential and said that, as Douglas said, his potential was 900. Louis still didn't believe it. Grandpa replied that Douglas put a lot of effort into his spells. Douglas and Louis looked at Grandpa. Grandpa rubbed his hands and said that he admired Douglas and the life he had led so far. Douglas smiled, looking at Grandpa. The villagers were saying goodbye to Douglas and Ravi at a small fence. Nicky stood with his head down. He asked if Douglas and Ravi really intended to leave. Douglas and Ravi thanked the villagers and did not hear Nicky. Douglas and Ravi looked at Nikki in surprise as he started shouting. He said that Ravi still hadn't learned a single skill and she might catch a cold again. They just needed to go to the village. Ravi looked at Nikki in surprise. Nikki started screaming even louder that he liked Ravi. He wanted to be with her forever. He wanted her to be his bride. Douglas was shocked by Nikki's words. The villagers began to talk among themselves. Douglas thought that he was the only one who did not notice what was happening between Nikki and Ravi. Nikki tried to say something else but was interrupted by Ravi, who was holding on to Douglas, saying that she liked Douglas. Nikki was speechless at what he heard. The women of the village looked at Douglas with embarrassment and were touched by what was happening. Douglas and Ravi stood there thinking when they heard Lewis tell Nikki that now was not the time to bring up the subject. Douglas scratched his ear sheepishly and thought that he might be Ravi's adoptive father. Things like that were extremely nice. He felt pure and sincere affection for Ravi. Ravi held on to Douglas, and he thought that if he were her real father, he would be in much more sincere awe. Douglas and Ravi were startled by the sharp laughter. Louis stroked the head of his rejected son. Louis approached Douglas and said that he shouldn't pay attention to Nikki. They say boys grow up with broken hearts. Douglas looked at Louis in surprise. Louis handed Douglas the things that the entire village had collected. Douglas thanked Louis. Douglas and Ravi said goodbye to the entire village and set off. The villagers waved back at Douglas and Ravi. Louis looked at Ravi and Douglas and counted to 2. The whole village shouted the words, "Muscle power." Douglas and Ravi watched the village break away. Nikki was sitting at the place where he said goodbye to Ravi. Louis came up to him and asked how long Nikki would continue to sit at that place. Nikki told his father that, as soon as he grew up, he would leave that village. Nikki recalled the images of mermaids and said that Douglas told him about many things that can only be found in books. He wants to see them with his own eyes. He wants to learn many skills and go on a journey. Nikki cried bitterly and said that he wanted to see Ravi again. Louis looked at his son and started to stroke his head. He said that he was sure that Nikki would succeed and he was proud of him. Louis squatted down next to his son and they looked into the distance. Douglas and Ravi continued their journey. Douglas held the things the village had given him and thought he was happy the elven village had accepted them. It was the coziest he had ever been to. Douglas reached into his bag of things and pulled out a letter. It said that Louis sincerely thanked Douglas for his help, and he intended to think about installing a lightning rod. Douglas was surprised by the words he read. Douglas continued to read. It says that the village doesn't have the technology they need, for that they'll have to turn to the people. Maybe he'll rarely meet good people like Douglas, but he'll try to compromise. Douglas smiled and continued reading that it was Douglas who made Louis think about compromises, for which Louis was grateful to him. Ravi called out to Douglas, and he looked up from his reading. There was a rabbit-shaped cloud floating across the sky that Ravi was pointing to. Douglas and Ravi looked at the sky in admiration and continued on their way, with apples in the bag from the elf village. A chariot with 2 horses harnessed is driving up a small hill. Behind it, many mills are visible. Douglas and Ravi were riding in a chariot. She was looking out the window. They were going to the town of Milton to sell the necklace that was the catalyst for Ravi's curse. Douglas smiled and thought about the past. The wagon continued to move away from the many mills. Douglas continued to think that the road to Milton would take several days, as there would be stops in towns along the way. Then they would walk to Balzac. Douglas looked at Ravi, who continued to look out the window and watch the windmills. He wants to show Ravi how beautiful the world can be. Douglas, hearing the conversation of 2 passengers, turned around. They were discussing the group of the hero Alan, who were in the city of Balzac. They were recruiting new team members. Douglas recognized the name that the strangers were talking about and was scared. Douglas remembered the leader of the groups. Alan and his team, he thought that he left Balzac a few months ago, but the group is still there. Douglas did not believe in recruiting new people to the team, since the team always had a minimum of people. Douglas turned to the passengers and asked them to tell him more about Alan's group. The passengers said that they had told him all they knew and that they had no more information. Douglas smiled and apologized for disturbing them. Then a girl in the black cloak asked how much Douglas was willing to pay to know more information. Douglas asked to repeat what the girl had said again. The girl took off her hood and rubbed it with her fingers. She said that she was a seamstress from Balzac and knew a lot of information that interested Douglas, but it had to be paid for, and since he didn't look very rich, she was ready to give a good discount. Douglas stood in the passage and looked at the girl. He thought that he was interested in information about his former comrades. One of the passengers told the girl that she was a magician from Milton. The girl was unhappy with the remarks made about her. Douglas stood and watched what was happening with his mouth open. The passengers began to threaten the girl. They said that if she created problems for others, they would hand her over to the military police. The girl looked angrily at the men and remained silent. Ravi was looking at Douglas's back, he noticed. Then Douglas turned and patted Ravi on the head. She continued to look at him. Douglas patted Ravi on the head and apologized to the passengers around him for disturbing him. The girl propped her face with her hand and said that Douglas was trying to be a good guy. Douglas held out his hand and said that she could be either a seamstress from Balzac or a magician from Milton. There was nothing wrong with that. The girl frowned and looked away. The girl folded her arms under her chest and screamed that she had no intention of continuing the conversation with Douglas, now that her secret had been revealed. Douglas looked away and smiled. The carriage continued to move, and the girl said no more. 5 days passed. Douglas and Ravi arrived in the town of Milton. They looked at many houses. In the middle of the town there was a river. Douglas presented a map with a river that divided the city into 3 large sections. These were the Old City, the upper-class area called the 16th District on the left side of the Lura River, and the 3rd section, Bacchus Alley, with beautiful rooftops in sight. Douglas and Ravi headed to Area 16, where Morse lived, who was supposed to buy the necklace, but he was absent. Douglas and Ravi were told that Morse would be back in 5 days. They headed for Bacchus Alley. Douglas walked next to Ravi and said that he would not mind waiting for Baron Morse for 5 days. Ravi looked at Douglas and supported his wish. Douglas and Ravi were walking down the street. Locals were drinking nearby. Ravi said she was willing to wait, as she didn't know who might buy the dark necklace. Douglas looked towards Ravi. Ravi smiled and held her bag like a river. Then she said that she enjoyed traveling with Douglas. She wouldn't mind continuing to travel with him. Douglas thought that with the increase in the length of the trip, the expenses for it would also increase. It would be worth returning to the city as soon as possible, where Ravi could settle permanently. But maybe he was imagining things in vain. Douglas, realizing her intentions, smiled. Then Douglas picked up Ravi in his arms and said that in that case, they should rest a little. Milton is a big city. They can try different kinds of sweets. Douglas held Ravi in his arms as they and the rest of the residents were attracted by a scream. Douglas let Ravi down and said he was going to check out what had happened and find a place to hide nearby. There were several people standing in the narrow alley. One of the men in a shirt and long hair had his hands in his pockets and several rings on his fingers. 3 men were hovering over one who was kneeling. His name was Ted. The man in the shirt said that Ted needed to get the girl. Ted was lying on the ground, shaking with fear, and said that he could not bring the girl. His duty was to protect Princess Rose. The man in the shirt was not happy with Ted's answer and ordered his escorts to beat him. The men took out sticks and began to swing at Ted. The men were stopped by Douglas's shout that they had to stop because Teddy was already wounded. Douglas stepped between the bandits and Teddy. Douglas, with a straight face, said he didn't know what had happened, but attacking one person was too much. The man in the sword grabbed Douglas by the jacket and started yelling that he shouldn't get involved in something that wasn't his business, because he could get hurt too. Douglas grabs the man's hand in the shirt. He lets go of Douglas's clothes and goes into shock from what is happening. His hand starts shaking. The man clenches his teeth and does not understand where Douglas, who continues to hold his hand, gets such strength from. The man's assistants call his name, Carlos. Carlos in turn tells them to be quiet. Douglas calls the man's name. He gets scared. Douglas looks at Carlos and tells him that he needs to let him go. Carlos clenched his teeth. Not saying a word, his hand continued to shake. Douglas and Carlos's hand are separated. Carlos holds onto his hand. He turns away from Douglas and tells the deputies that they need to leave. The deputies are shocked by what is happening. They leave. Douglas watches them go. Carlos turns to Douglas and makes a sign with his fingers that he is watching him. The bandits move away from Douglas and Teddy. Douglas scratches his head and says that Robbie can come out. Everything is okay now. Robbie looks around the corner. Teddy, sitting on his knees, looks towards where Robbie is standing. Teddy started to get to his feet and doubled over in pain. Douglas looked at Teddy and asked if he was okay. Douglas thought Teddy's leg looked broken. Douglas knelt down. He extended his hand towards Teddy and cast a healing spell. Teddy looked at his healed leg and said that it didn't hurt anymore. Douglas looked at Teddy and said that he had healed his leg with magic, but it would still be difficult to walk for a while because the mind did not realize that the body had been healed. Teddy looked at Douglas and tried to get up, but he fell. Douglas and Ravi were afraid for Teddy. Douglas extended his hand to Teddy and said that he should give him a cane. Douglas intended to walk Teddy home. Teddy smiled and thanked Douglas. Douglas held Teddy as they walked through the streets of the city and came to the red light district of Maisie. They stood in front of a large gate from which people were entering and exiting. Douglas was shocked by the red light district. Teddy leaned one hand on Douglas's shoulder and said that the place where he works is just behind the gate. Douglas turned to Teddy and asked him again where he worked. Teddy replied that he worked in an entertainment venue. Teddy looked at Douglas with confusion. Douglas closed his eyes and began to think that most likely the place was closed since it was only noon. Douglas agreed to go to work for Teddy. There was a long house with several outbuildings on the street and trees growing in the yard. The laundry was drying and fluttering in the wind. Douglas and Teddy went into a room with a table and chairs. Douglas looked around and said it was quieter than he expected. Teddy leaned on Douglas's shoulder and said it was an outbuilding behind the main building, and besides, everyone was still asleep. Douglas helped Teddy sit down on the chair and thought that he was being too careful. If they fought in this place, it could have a bad effect on Ravi. They needed to leave this place quickly. A woman in dark clothes entered the room and asked why Teddy was in such a state, what could have happened. Teddy looked at the woman and said that Douglas had protected him from Carlos. The woman thanked Douglas. Douglas waved his hand and said that there was no need to worry. The woman cheerfully exclaimed that he could not just let Douglas go. They needed to sit down. She would treat them to cake. Ravi, hearing about the cake, ran towards the table. There was a tea set with cutlery and a cake on the table. Ravi was eating the cake with a fork and listening to compliments about her appearance. Behind Ravi and Douglas, who were drinking tea and eating cake, stood the girls from the establishment, discussing how Douglas had saved Teddy. Douglas drank his tea sheepishly and thought that the girls were dressed too revealingly. The woman in black said that Douglas had saved them from Carlos and his henchmen, as they had been making their lives difficult lately. Douglas continued drinking tea. The woman put her hands on the table and said that Douglas could stay at their establishment and start working as a bodyguard. Douglas was surprised by the woman's offer. The woman continued to say that he needed to guard for 5 days. He would be paid well for it. And as soon as some circumstances were sorted out, these guys would not be able to cause them any more trouble. Douglas thought about how they had planned to stay in this city for exactly 5 days. Then he said that he refused because he was traveling, especially with a child. The women began to persuade Douglas and Ravi to stay for a while. Douglas looked at the women. He was confused. The women surrounded Douglas. He thought that if he was alone, he would help them. But in these few days that they would stay in this place, Ravi might see things that she shouldn't. Douglas, sitting on a chair, said that he had to refuse their offer. The woman in black said that she asked for forgiveness because she was asking for something excessive. Ravi looked at Douglas. Behind her, the women were saying that they had managed somehow so far, and this time, they would figure something out. Ravi was dejected. There was a plate with half-eaten cake on the table. Night fell. The lights came on in the windows of the houses. Ravi sat on the bed and asked Douglas, who was wiping things, if he wasn't going to help those people they had met today. Douglas thought and did not say a word. At that very moment, tears began to roll down Ravi's face. Douglas was frightened by what he saw. Douglas stood up from his chair in panic. He didn't understand why Ravi was crying. Ravi continued to cry bitterly. A grimace of horror appeared on Douglas's face. He began to calm her down. Ravi and Douglas were sitting next to each other on the bed, next to which was a table, a chair, and a backpack. Ravi was wiping her face with a towel. Douglas looked at Ravi and thought she was angry with him. Ravi placed the towel on her feet. Douglas continued to look at her and think that because he didn't help people, he felt disappointed. Douglas imagined a man and a woman hugging against a backdrop of houses and thought he could explain to Ravi why he did it. But she wouldn't understand that he didn't want to let her into an adult establishment that might have a bad influence on her. Douglas looked at Ravi's tear-stained face and thought that if he told her about the adult world, it would have a bad effect on her. He only wanted to show her beautiful things. Ravi broke the silence and asked if he could explain why he refused to help the people. Ravi looked at him. She waited for Douglas to say something. Douglas looked at Ravi and remained silent. Douglas lowered his head and thought that he couldn't lie to suit the situation. Another bad trait of adults. Douglas was hesitant to tell Ravi the real reason for refusing to help. Ravi looked at Douglas and called him. He perked up. Ravi asked what people Douglas didn't want to help. Douglas looked at her and said that wasn't the case. Ravi asked then why Douglas didn't help those people. Douglas closed his eyes. Douglas's feet were on the floor. Ravi's feet were not touching the floor. Douglas said that the place they went to today was an adult establishment. Ravi did not know what that place meant. Douglas folded his arms and said that it was a bad place. Ravi listened attentively to Douglas. Douglas looked at Ravi and said, "Let's say you have a loved one who hugs you, and you feel happy." Ravi looked at Douglas and said that she is happy when he hugs her. Douglas hesitated. Douglas rearranged the well-dressed people and said that if you found such a person, it was good, but not everyone had such a chance. To fill the loneliness, men paid women to be affectionate with them. This was an adult establishment. Ravi looked at Douglas and asked if paying money to get attention was bad. Douglas put his hand on his heart and said that people were trying to fill their loneliness that way and it was not something bad. Douglas turned to Ravi and said that he thought that paying for love was rather sad, so he didn't want to let Ravi near that place. Ravi looked at Douglas and asked what was the reason he refused to help them. Douglas agreed. Davi hung her head. Douglas looked at Ravi. She said that his intentions were good, but that was no reason to refuse to help people. Ravi put her hands on her knees and said that at first, when she was alone, she was sad too. But then she met Douglas. Ravi turned and looked at Douglas. She said that she liked Douglas better who helps people, so she would like him to help them anyway. Douglas looked at Ravi and thought that adults should guide children, and earlier they had agreed with Ravi to discuss all decisions and advice. Douglas looked away and smiled. He apologized to Ravi for his behavior. The next day came. Ravi and Douglas approached the entertainment establishment. Drunk and homeless people were lying on the street looking at them. Douglas wondered what Ravi would think of these people. Ravi looked around and enjoyed the good weather. Douglas leaned over and stroked her head. He looked up and thought that he was worrying too much. Ravi could see the beauty in life with her own eyes. He should look at the world more broadly too. Douglas put his hand on Ravi's shoulder. They were surrounded by tall buildings on the sides of the street. He thought that he needed more patience if he was going to protect the people dear to him, without hurting them. Ravi and Douglas were scared by the screams that started in the middle of the street. There was a crowd of armed men standing on the street. It was Carlos and his partners. They threatened Teddy, who was lying on the ground, and the owner of the entertainment establishment. Carlos ordered Princess Rose to be brought to him. The owner of the establishment was in a panic. Other girls were standing behind her, and Carlos continued to shout threats at them. At that moment, a girl with long hair came out of the building. She was unhappy with the noise. The girl stood in the doorway wearing a translucent dress. She said that they were making too much noise. The employees of the establishment were shocked by Rose's appearance. Carlos approached Rose and said that today she would definitely be his. In turn, she replied that as he wanted, she showed up. Now he should leave this place. Carlos was shocked by what he heard. Rose approached him and said with a smile that she had no time for the likes of him and his gang. Carlos's eyes filled with anger. Carlos grabs Rose by her clothes, then swings his arm and starts insulting her. Rose does not look away for a minute. Douglas appears next to Carlos and Rose, telling Carlos to stop. Everyone is surprised by Douglas's sudden appearance. Carlos, without lowering his hands, looks towards Douglas. There was a dark atmosphere around Douglas. He was angry. Carlos and his henchmen were frightened by the atmosphere around Douglas. The bandits were scared. They remembered Douglas and started talking to each other. Carlos ordered them to shut up. Douglas's eyes lit up with rage. Carlos was overcome with terror, and he and his henchmen began to run away. Douglas and Ravi watched the fleeing bandits. Douglas leaned over to Ravi, took her in his arms and said that he was sorry for coming so late. He would like to accept the offer to become a bodyguard for the entertainment establishment. The woman in black and the rest of the staff looked at Douglas with admiration. Rose walked towards Douglas and Ravi. She approached them and said that she was grateful to Douglas. Rose stroked Douglas's clothes with her hand and offered her services as a token of gratitude. Douglas froze in surprise and refused the offer. Then a girl in a short dress appears, holding a shovel, running and screaming that she will save Princess Rose. She scared away the crowd and ended up behind Rose. The girl was lit up around. She did not understand where the bandits had gone. Douglas and Rose were surprised by the unexpected appearance of the stranger. They looked towards the dark-haired girl who was sitting on the ground and looking at them. A dark-haired girl dressed in a dress and shoes. She was squatting. Douglas was standing in front of her. He was holding Ravi in his arms. The girl started pointing at Douglas. Douglas and the girl remembered each other. They had met earlier in the stagecoach on the way to the city. The woman in black was surprised that the dark-haired girl, Veronica, knew Douglas. Veronica spread her arms and said that they were just getting to know each other. Rose stood nearby and watched what was happening. Veronica turned around sharply. Her face was furrowed. She grabbed Douglas by the sleeve and asked him to step aside with her. Ravi hugged Douglas's neck in fear. He was also scared by Veronica's action. Veronica held Douglas's hand and pulled him along with her to the other end of the street. The girls working at the pleasure house looked at Douglas, Ravi, and Veronica in surprise as they separated. Ravi stood next to Douglas, and Veronica stood opposite them. Veronica crossed her arms under her chest and said that she would not forgive Douglas and Ravi if they spilled the beans about what happened in the carriage. Douglas stood silently and looked at Veronica. Douglas asked what exactly Veronica was talking about. She was waving her arms in anger and stomping her heel on the ground. She was screaming that she was talking about how she tried to deceive Douglas. He should keep it a secret. Douglas stretched his hand forward and said that Veronica should not worry. He would not tell anyone about what happened, as he was in this city for another reason. Veronica asked for proof of his words. Douglas was surprised by her words. Douglas was surprised by her words. Veronica rushed towards him and shouted that Douglas had to prove that he would never gossip about this, since there was no one in the world who could be trusted. Douglas scratched his head in confusion. Veronica smiled and said that she was ready to pay him for his silence. Douglas was surprised by the words spoken. Veronica pushed Douglas against the wall and put her hand on his clothes. She said that she would wait for him at her place tonight, and he would need to leave Ravi with someone. Ravi stood nearby, her face red, not understanding what was happening. Douglas pulled away from the wall towards Ravi and covered her with his hand. He said that he was not going to preach, but Veronica was behaving inappropriately. Veronica pushed back with one hand against the wall and said that it was the first time she had met such a person. Douglas closed Ravi's eyes as Veronica started touching your body and screaming that she didn't understand what part of her body she was touching. She looked like a child. Douglas asked her to calm down. The women stood nearby and laughed at what was happening. Douglas held Ravi by the shoulder and said that he would keep Veronica's secret and would not take money for it. He could not take it in order to keep his promise. Veronica did not understand why Douglas refused the money. Veronica held a bag in her hands and said that Douglas was a hypocrite and considered himself superior to her. Douglas replied that if Veronica paid hush money, it would be a contract, not an agreement, and without it he would keep his promise. Douglas was surprised as Veronica started screaming that she couldn't believe his words. If they made a contract, she would be sure that he wouldn't betray her. Veronica angrily shoved money at Douglas. Douglas turned away and looked down, thinking that a contract was not a guarantee of silence. He didn't understand why Veronica was so persistent. She swung her arm and threw the bag of money on the ground with a scream. The woman in black screamed nervously. She did not understand why Veronica was behaving like this. Veronica turned around at the woman's scream. Douglas was standing next to her, perplexed. Veronica opened her mouth to say something, but she didn't have time. Rose stood next to the woman in black. She looked at Veronica and said that Veronica was acting like a child. After these words, Veronica's face turned red. She became embarrassed. Veronica followed Rose, who said that Douglas was their important guest who was hired as a bodyguard. Veronica should stop bothering him. She agreed with Rose's words. Douglas stood silently and looked into the distance. The day went on. Douglas and Ravi were sitting at the table. A woman in black came to them with tea and said that she apologized for Veronica's behavior. Douglas replied that there was no need to apologize. The woman put the cups of tea on the table and asked if they could really count on Douglas's help. Douglas apologized for refusing to help yesterday. The woman put her hands on the table and said he didn't need to apologize. The woman remembered Carlos and his team. She said that Carlos had developed feelings for Rose. He came to her every day with the intention of making her his. Douglas and Ravi sat at the table and looked at the woman attentively. She continued to say that Carlos was very cruel to the girls, so they did not let him near Rose, and because of this, he began to annoy them. The woman leaned her elbows on the table and put her head in her hands. Douglas thought that he would be glad to help these women. Douglas said that he wanted to think of a way to protect them from Carlos. Ravi looked at Douglas. The woman sat up straight in her chair and said that Carlos had started causing trouble near the establishment. But then the children joined in and threw trash at the house. The woman and Ted began patrolling the area, and Ted ended up getting hurt. The woman took the cup. Ravi looked at her carefully. Douglas asked why not just stop soliciting customers. The woman replied that if this was not done, there would be no clients at all, and along with them, there would be no money. Douglas looked at his wife. He thought that he would only be able to protect women for 4 days. There was a possibility that after his departure, people like Carlos might appear, and they would not be able to protect them again. Douglas put his hand to his mouth and thought that he wanted to find a way to protect these women. A handkerchief fell from above onto the table. Douglas and the woman looked up in surprise. This handkerchief was accidentally dropped by Teddy. It was standing on the second floor of the house. The woman looked at it. She got angry and said that she and Douglas were having an important conversation. The handkerchief was lying on the table. Douglas had an idea. The woman looked at him in surprise, and he said that if it was dangerous to attract customers from the outside, then women could attract them inside the building, through the windows. The woman replied that if the girls shouted loudly from the windows, it would, on the contrary, repel visitors and disturb others. Douglas picked up the handkerchief from the table and let it go, saying that it was not necessary to establish direct contact to engage clients. The woman's mouth dropped open at the words. The woman rose from her chair and said that clients should be lured by the girl's secrecy, which will attract them. Ravi looked at the handkerchief lying on the table in surprise. Ravi came up to Douglas. She had a flower in her hands. She said that she had picked it for Douglas. He thanked her for it. On the table next to Douglas lay a box of sewing supplies. Ravi sat on the table next to him, holding flowers in her hands. She asked what Douglas was going to do with the fabric that was lying on the table. Douglas began cutting the fabric with scissors. Douglas stitched a piece of fabric and gathered it into a flower shape. Ravi watched in awe as Douglas held the fabric flower in his hands. Douglas pictured girls throwing artificial flowers from windows and said that if girls did this, they would make people pay attention to them. Ravi held a flower. The woman approved of the idea. The woman stood next to Ravi and Douglas. Then she said that she could wake the girls up to help make the flowers. Douglas replied that there was no point in waking them up. The girls needed to rest, and they could cope on their own. The woman looked at Douglas with a smile and said that he was a good man and that all this fabric was at his disposal. The woman went up the stairs to find some more unnecessary fabric. Ravi stood next to her holding a flower. Douglas also held a flower and said that he needed to make more folds in the fabric so that the flower would look like the flower that Ravi had picked for him. Ravi smiled, holding the flower in her hands as she heard from Douglas that he needed her help. She agreed to his request. Douglas and Ravi cut and pressed pieces of fabric together to create many faux flowers, and they were completely absorbed in the process. It was already dark. On the table in front of Douglas and Ravi, there was a large number of fabric flowers, which were difficult to count. Douglas was rubbing his shoulder from fatigue. Ravi was delighted with the work done. Ravi called Douglas, and with a smile on her face, she said that many flowers would fall from the sky and people who saw them would be delighted. Douglas agreed with her. The girls in pajamas were standing on the stairs. They were wondering what Douglas and Ravi were doing. Ravi was startled by the unexpected appearance and threw some flowers up. Douglas pointed to the flowers. The girls were delighted. They asked how they could address Douglas. He introduced himself and introduced Ravi. The girls were shocked by what they heard. One of them screamed that Douglas was a guardian and an adventurer. This scared Douglas and Ravi very much. He was surprised how the girls knew him. Ravi climbed onto Douglas's lap. The girls said that Douglas was famous. One of the girls handed Douglas a piece of paper. He looked at it and was surprised. He did not understand what was written on the sheet could mean. Douglas looked at the piece of paper and did not understand why it could attract so much attention. The girl answered that it was obvious, since he had defeated the dragon. A sleepy Veronica entered the room. The woman in black said that she knew Douglas was good, but that he had solved the problem at Matlock's shelter, and that she now had girls from that shelter working for her. Veronica was stunned by what she heard. Douglas looked at the girls in silence. Douglas smiled. He wanted to say something, but he didn't have time. Veronica interrupted him. She stood at a distance and said that Douglas was a hypocrite because he was proud of doing good deeds. Her face was full of anger. The woman in black got angry and shouted that Veronica should shut up. The girls looked at Veronica in surprise. Douglas looked at Veronica in shock. She started screaming with tears in her eyes that she would never thank him, because it would look like he saved her. Veronica started running out of the room. The girls tried to stop her. Someone clapped their hands. Everyone looked in surprise in the direction where the noise was coming from. It was Rose. She was standing on the second floor. She said that Veronica snapped at Douglas quite sharply. She was wondering what the flowers were for. She asked Douglas and Robbie to leave the room. The next day came. Douglas, Ravi, and Rose were outside in the inner garden. Rose stood in front of Robbie and Douglas. She said that she apologized for the incident with Veronica yesterday because she was acting like a child. Douglas looked at Rose. Douglas stood in front of Rose and asked about Veronica being sold at Matlock Orphanage. Rose wondered why Douglas was so interested in this question. Douglas looked ahead and said that he had to find out the answer to his question. Rose stood in her heels on the ground and said that Douglas was taking too much on himself by trying to save the people he met in life. Rose continued to say, smiling slightly, that in her opinion his thinking is arrogant. He wants to help people in need, like a parent protects his child. Douglas looks at Rose in surprise. She put her hand on her waist and said that she also has a child, which she gave birth to at 15. The girl is now 4 years old and is currently having dinner with other children in the dining room. Rose stepped aside and said that Douglas couldn't save all the people who needed it and that he shouldn't poke his nose into other people's business. Douglas thought about it and agreed with Rose. A gusty wind picked up and Douglas said that he couldn't ignore people who were suffering. Ravi's hair was blowing in the wind, and Douglas continued to say that he couldn't help. But if there was a small chance that he could save someone, he should take it. Douglas holds a flower petal in his hands and looks at it closely. He says that this is why he became an adventurer. Rose touched her face with her hand and said that Douglas was very kind-hearted. Douglas gave the petal to Ravi and said that he was just stubborn. Rose's smile disappeared as she said that, as Douglas had suspected, Veronica was an orphan who had been sold at Matlock Orphanage. It happened when she was 9 years old. 6 years have passed since then. Flower petals fell to the ground. Douglas's mouth dropped open in shock. He stood at the table in front of Rose and began shouting that Veronica was just a 9-year-old child. Rose responded that Madam was a respectable person now, but the woman who ran the place in the past was a bad person. Rose recalled the events of the past days. Veronica was hiding in the stable, next to a haystack. Someone was looking for her with a lantern in their hands. The girl with the color in her hair loomed over Veronica. Veronica lay in horror. She saw this girl for the first time. The girl sat down next to Veronica. She was holding a suitcase in her hands and said that she was Veronica's new mentor. Veronica was wounded. The girl wrapped her injured hand with a bandage. Veronica's mentor tied a bow on her hand and said that girls like them have nowhere to run. Veronica just needs to accept her situation. If Veronica wants to be free, then she needs to live here. The teacher hugged Veronica. Tears appeared in Veronica's eyes. Rose recalled how Veronica's face changed after a while. Rose went on to say that Veronica began saving money to escape, but 6 years later, the girls received a letter. Veronica stood surrounded by other girls and read the letter. It said that their detention was illegal. From that day, they were free. Rose looked at Douglas and said that when they heard the news, they were happy and Veronica left. But after a while, she came back, although she no longer had debts. Rose asked what Douglas thought, what words Veronica came back with. Veronica stood at the door with a suitcase. Other girls met her. She cried and said that she had nowhere to go. Douglas was speechless with shock. He clenched his fist and thought that he was 6 years too late. Rose looked at Douglas with interest. Rose, Douglas, and Ravi stood under a tree. Rose said she was sorry and she shouldn't have told the story. It only added to the burden on Douglas. Douglas replied that he felt obligated. He wanted to help Veronica. Ravi looked at Douglas. He said that he felt he needed to talk to Veronica. Rose's eyes widened. She remembered Veronica's words about kindness and help. Douglas and Ravi stood motionless. Rose smiled widely. Night fell. Veronica sat on the roof of the building and thoughtfully looked at the nearby houses of the city. She remembered her screams when she was promised to meet her real mother, but she was deceived. She was surrounded by laughing faces of adults. Veronica woke up when someone called her. She stood up and saw that it was Douglas and Ravi. She turned around and said that if Douglas was here to apologize, then she wasn't going to apologize. Douglas replied that that was not why he was here. Veronica raised her hand and started screaming that she didn't understand why he was here. That Douglas's presence next to her was making her angry. Her fist clenched. She closed her eyes and screamed loudly that Douglas couldn't save her and the other victims. But it wasn't just him. The other adults didn't do anything to save them either. It irritated her that everyone was reminding her of that. Ravi was scared. As Veronica finished speaking, Douglas leaned forward. Veronica stood there, not understanding what he was doing. He replied that he and other adults had failed to save her and the other children 6 years ago. Veronica didn't understand why Douglas was apologizing. Veronica leaned over a little and screamed that she already knew everything herself. She was just throwing a tantrum. Did Douglas have a reason to bow his head? Douglas looked down silently. He thought that if he had been in Addington 6 years ago, he would have saved all the children. But he failed. Small children were put in danger, and it hurts him to realize this. For this, he asks for forgiveness. Veronica blushed. Her eyes filled with tears from the words Douglas said that he was asking for forgiveness for not being able to save her that time. Veronica burst into tears. She did not understand why Douglas was apologizing. Veronica hung her head, tears streaming from her eyes. She said that Douglas was saying this now, but it was too late. It didn't matter, since her life was already over. Douglas countered that he was sure that Veronica still had many opportunities. Veronica wiped away her tears as Douglas continued to say that there were many opportunities in the world. She could go anywhere she wanted, be whoever she wanted. She asked if Douglas was trying to preach to her again. Douglas came over and stroked Veronica's head. She grabbed his hand, not understanding what he was doing. Douglas smiled and said he was just trying to comfort her. Ravi began to comfort Veronica too. Veronica was unhappy that she was considered a child. Veronica let go of her hands and rested them against Douglas. She said she didn't understand what was happening. But when someone was being comforted, it was often annoying. Veronica began to cry bitterly, leaning against Douglas. He stroked her head. Evening came. People appeared on the streets of the city. A girl in a cat costume hugged a man's hand and invited him to her. He smiled back at her. A moment later, a flower falls to the ground and those around raise their heads. On the balconies of the house, girls threw things and waved their hands at people on the street. The people around watched the beautiful spectacle in fascination. On one of the balconies stood Princess Rose, with flowers in her hair and hands, calling out to clients. The men looked at Rose and were confused. Veronica stood next to the house and watched as the people around her rushed to collect the flowers scattered on the ground. Veronica looked up at the falling flowers. Douglas, Ravi, Madam and Ted were nearby. Veronica remembered Douglas's words that she could be free and go wherever she wanted. Veronica began to smile. Veronica continued to watch the falling flowers and said that who did she want to become after all? A few days later, Douglas reflects that wherever he went, or whatever he did, he always felt Veronica's gaze on him. But as soon as he caught her doing it, she would start screaming and run away. Douglas watched Veronica run away. She seemed mysterious to him. Ravi stood next to him and helped him clean up. Douglas washed the dishes. It was his last day in this house. Next to Douglas stood a madam. He said that he was interested in why he was hired for such a short period. Madam answered that the leader of these hooligans, Baron Morse, was returning tomorrow. The woman was smoking a pipe. She looked at Douglas and said that Baron Morse was with his subordinates, and if she reported Carlos's actions, the Baron would punish him and he would not bother them anymore. Douglas turned to Madam. Now he understood what was going on. Ravi carried the washed dishes to Teddy, who was squatting. Douglas told Madam that he and Ravi wanted to give the cursed object to Baron Morse. The woman put the phone down on the table and said that it wouldn't happen. He might be eccentric, but he wasn't a worthless person. Douglas got nervous. He thought that today was Carlos's only chance to do something. Douglas and Ravi were helping the girls hang out the laundry. Douglas thought that the last time he saw Carlos was the day he met him at the gate of the house. Loud sounds were heard. Everyone looked in the direction from where the noise was coming. Carlos kicks down the wooden door, the shards of which fall to the ground. He enters the interior of the house where the laundry was hanging out. Douglas and Ravi looked towards Carlos. Carlos looked at Douglas and said that it had been several days since their last meeting. Douglas should bring Princess Rose. Douglas refused to do so. Carlos was angry when he heard Douglas's answer. Carlos spread his arms out to the side. Scary bandits appeared behind him. He started shouting that Douglas could repeat his answer again. Carlos raised his hand and said that he hired these bandits from Balzac who could defeat Douglas. The girl standing behind Douglas ran away in fear. Douglas looked ahead and thought that Carlos had been quiet for the last few days because he was waiting for reinforcements from Balzac. The girls were packing. Douglas told them that they needed to go around back and be sure to take Ravi with them. Douglas stood before the bandits and said that if Carlos liked Princess Rose, then he should leave her alone all the more, since winning a girl by force is unworthy of a man. Carlos was embarrassed by the words he heard. Carlos turned red and shouted that Douglas should shut up and stop preaching to him, just as his father, Baron Morse, had done the same. Carlos ordered the bandits to deal with Douglas. Several of them armed themselves and headed towards Douglas. A moment later, several bandits fell to the ground. They lay motionless. Douglas and Carlos looked at the bandits lying on the ground in surprise. Then Carlos staggered and also fell to the ground. His eyes were open. He did not understand what was happening to him. Everyone thought that Douglas had dealt with the bandits, but he denied his involvement in what happened. Douglas's attention was drawn to a dark silhouette on the roof, holding a needle in his hands. There was a black-haired boy sitting on the roof. He was smiling and holding needles floating in the air in his hand. He asked Douglas if it was possible that he saw his attack. Douglas opened his mouth in surprise. The young man put his hands on his chest and jumped off the roof, landing not far from Douglas. He said that his attack was too fast for anyone to notice. Douglas thought that this man looked very dangerous. The young man had a creepy aura about him. Douglas thought that this guy was different from the people he had met before. The guy said with a smile on his face that he would get down to business for now. Behind Douglas, there were bandits. He turned around as they began to writhe in pain. Carlos asked for help. Seeing this, Douglas was scared. The bandits were lying on the ground. A dark aura enveloped everything around. The stranger first walked towards Douglas, then began to swing. Douglas shouted that this guy had to stop. The young man casts a spell, which begins to fly towards Douglas. A strong wind begins to sweep away those around him. The girls try to hide from it. Douglas deflected the blow in the opposite direction from where the girls were standing. The spell hit the wall. An explosion occurred. Douglas looked away. He realized that the games were imbued with poison magic. The young man scratched his chin and said that, why was Douglas bothering him? Weren't the bandits his enemies? Douglas watched him attentively, without taking his eyes off the stranger. Douglas stood in a fighting stance. He said that was not the case. The guy put his hand on his belt and said that Douglas was too soft, and wherever Douglas went, he did not fight with the intention of killing someone. Douglas perked up at the words he heard, and the guy continued to say that if Douglas could deal with anyone, he wouldn't try to save Fenrir. Douglas remembered the events of the fight with Fenrir, and he was dumbfounded that this guy was following him. Douglas immediately realized that he was wrong. The stranger was not following him. His real target was Ravi. A creepy stranger stood in front of Douglas. Realizing the gravity of what was happening, he turned around and saw Ravi frozen in fear. She was shaking all over. Tears of horror appeared in her eyes. The stranger spread his arms out to the side and walked towards Douglas. He said that it seemed Douglas was beginning to suspect something. Douglas looked at the guy with a serious face. The stranger's face took on a menacing look. He said that he intended to disappear with Ravi right now. Ravi pressed her hands to her chest in fear. Douglas covered her with his hand and said that he did not intend to give her up. The stranger stopped. Douglas thought warily that he didn't know who this guy was, but he was clearly Ravi's enemy. The stranger had 2 swords in sheaths hanging on his belt. He raised his hands. He began to smile and said that in that case, first of all, he would deal with Douglas. The dark-haired guy smiled evilly. Looking at his opponents, he was about to use poison magic, and 3 claws appeared in his hand. He swung at Douglas, but Douglas managed to jump back. His attention was drawn by such a movement from his opponent. Because he realized that the opponent was not aiming at them, the needles flew past and were heading for people. Douglas raised his hand up and was very serious. He used air magic, namely wind, and with his flow, he directed the flying needles in another direction, changing their direction. Then something caught the man's attention. He turned around and saw that his comrades were already lying motionless on the ground, and their weapons were lying next to them. As it turned out, his allies were poisoned, and Douglas decided that he had to use his skills at the same time. In doing so, he used detoxification magic. One of the girl's eyes opened a little and she tried to say something, but she only showed how much pain she was in. Douglas realized that the poison was spreading quickly, and at this rate, it would take some time until the poison was completely gone. Suddenly, the dark-haired guy came close to Douglas, because he realized that he could easily handle the simultaneous use of skills. Douglas didn't understand when he had managed to get so close, and the dark-haired man, swinging, said that he had reached his maximum. At that very second, the blow landed right on Douglas's head. The man winced, shocked by what this guy had done. And eventually he realized that these techniques and physical attributes, without making a single sound, were a clear manifestation of assassin behavior. But for Douglas, it was another reason to find out why such a man would target Ravi. The man had shielded the girl with his body, protecting her. His opponent wanted to know what he would do now. Douglas looked at the boy seriously and wiped his mouth from the blood that had accumulated on it. The opponent knocked his sword out of his hands and said that if he did not interrupt one of the magics now, he would not be able to attack. But if he interrupts, then the girls who earn money in an unconventional way and the hooligans can suffer greatly. All the people lying there were unconscious. Douglas used air magic again, namely wind. The dark-haired guy thought that he was pretending to be the guardian of this little girl. The enemy smiled sarcastically and said that he loved to watch people abandon each other in trouble. And he decided to demonstrate this to the rabbit, and also to show how things are in the adult world. Douglas swung angrily and told him to shut up because that was not what he wanted to show her. The man swung, but into thin air, because the boy had time to jump back. He jumped into the air and called Douglas an old man, saying that he was annoyed because he was not sure that he could answer him with indifference. At this, the guy took out his needles again. Blades began to fall from the sky, which puzzled Douglas. The girls who were standing nearby began to hiccup and were very scared. The man still did not understand what had happened. He knew that if he canceled the detoxification magic, Carlos and his friends would disappear, and he would be forced to use air magic on the entire sky. His opponent taunted him, trying to find out who he would leave behind. Douglas continued to fight, and the guy wanted to understand whether he would save the girls of Easy Virtue and Hooligans, or Ravi. The moment the guy finished speaking, he found himself behind Ravi and Douglas. The assassin had already started to attack, but Douglas immediately understood everything and turned to his opponent. The guy's blade was right next to Ravi, which surprised her very much, and she stood with her mouth open. There was a sound of impact. Heavenly blades began to fall from the sky with a loud ringing sound. The assassin struck right into Douglas's side. His blade was already a different color, but the man stood firm. Suddenly his face changed. Drops appeared on his armor. There was a gaping wound in his side as well as a clone sticking out of it. Ravi reached out her hand to the man, calling him Daddy. Douglas threw the assassin away with one movement, but the assassin managed to dodge, doing a neat backflip. Landing on the ground, he said that sacrificing his body to protect someone seemed boring to him. Although heavily wounded, Douglas continued to defend himself using air magic. At that moment, a strong gust of wind hid the assassin from them. The blade, still in Douglas's side, made itself known again. Blood spurted out of the man's mouth again. Ravi immediately ran up to him, very concerned about her dad's condition. Tears were streaming from her eyes, and she kept calling out to him as the blade was destroying him. The girl's tears fell on her father's hand. He asked her not to cry like that because he wanted to protect her smile. And Douglas didn't want the person who was most important to him to get hurt. And so he was going to do anything to keep his word. Lightning began to form in his hands, and he let out a very loud scream, which confused his opponent. The assassin didn't understand where Douglas got so much energy from, even after he plunged a knife into his gut. The man looked up at his opponent and said that he had someone he had to protect. The guy interrupted him, not letting him finish, and began to rapidly approach the man. At the same time, he said menacingly that then he would simply leave Douglas without a heart. At the same moment, he pushed off the ground, jumping again. But the man was not going to give up. He continued to gather his energy in his hands and finish his sentence, that therefore he would exceed his limits to stop him. And he used the power of the god of wrath, who commands lightning. He asked for his fury to be shown and called upon the power of thunderclap. The assassin was shocked that he could use another spell, and thought that such a thing was impossible. Douglas glowed with a bright light and said loudly that he was using triple skill use. He pointed his hand towards the ground, saying that he was using lightning magic, namely thunder. The assassin was thrown upwards and fell, his body making a soft sound. Ravi sat on her knees and spoke to her dad again. He swayed and asked her to stay put. After all, he needed to first, remove the poison from himself. He directed detoxification magic at himself and immediately pointed his hand at his former opponent. Douglas used simultaneous use of skills again. The assassin lay motionless and was affected by the magic of starlight, namely, the shackles of light. Suddenly, the boy woke up and tried to understand what he was going to do if he grabbed him, and the thought came to him that he would try to destroy him. Douglas realized that the enemy had already regained consciousness. He then told him that he would hand him over to the military police. The assassin said with resentment that this was already a little worrying, because his employer would be angry. The man tried to find out who his employer was and why they were targeting Ravi. The assassin said he should have asked the rabbit. The guy looked at the little girl who was hiding a whole mountain of secrets. Douglas was irritated, and he really didn't want to hear anything from this guy. The girls behind him immediately ran up to Ravi, but Douglas only glanced at them and thought that he should end this conversation for now. Douglas turned to the girls and addressed Veronica and everyone else because he wanted to make sure they weren't hurt. He also asked for forgiveness because he wanted to ask him to look after Carlos and the others. She agreed. The assassin sat on the ground and looked at his tied hands with the help of lightning. At the same time, the guy said that he was sorry because in the end it was his failure. At that very moment, the boy put his hands behind his back, which puzzled Douglas. Before he realized anything, the assassin started doing something. Suddenly, the bracelet that bound his hands was torn. Douglas stood there in confusion. As it turned out, the assassin had a knife hidden in his heel, and his hands began to be freed. At the same moment, he began to jump back and say goodbye to the man. The assassin, with a terrible smile, said, after that Douglas owed him, namely, for his hands. Here the guy had already jumped onto the roof, thereby disappearing. Douglas was shouting after him for him to stop. But then the man grabbed his side, because he was bleeding again. The man was about to use his healing skill again. Robbie started running towards her dad and tried to shout to him because she was worried about him. It was pitch black. Douglas opened his eyes and found himself in bed. There was a second bed above his head and he was completely alone in the room. Douglas sat up in bed and realized that this was the room in the prostitute's house where he and Ravi were staying, and it looked like he had been transported here. Suddenly, Ravi appeared from behind the door, happily addressing him. The man called her name and immediately winced in pain. The girl asked her father not to move because the stitches the doctor had put on the wound might come apart. Douglas asked again, uncomprehending. Ravi started to say that Dad had a terrible wound, and they said there was no healer skilled enough in this town to heal it. Douglas lifted his shirt and saw the stitching. He understood everything, because if they could heal serious wounds by simply stitching them up, then they would be able to make a living with the hero's group. The man began to stroke the girl's hair, saying that he probably made her worry. He also decided to calm her down, saying that he would be fine now. At the same time, using full restoration on himself. At that moment, the man asked Robbie to pay attention to the seam that had disappeared. At that, Douglas said that he was already feeling better. The girl, with genuine excitement, wanted to know if it hurt. He said with a sincere smile that it didn't hurt. Suddenly, the man's face changed. As it turned out, the little girl started crying. She was happy that he was better, and that was her relief. Tears were falling from her childish eyes like hail, and she was repeating the same words over and over. Douglas immediately grabbed Robbie's face, wiping her cheeks from salty tears and asking her not to cry. Suddenly, the door clicked and a man appeared behind it. She heard someone's voices and realized that he had come to his senses. There were many people standing outside the door, and the main representative informed Douglas that he had slept for more than a day. He turned to the woman. The woman interrupted him and reminded him of yesterday, because her girls and Carlos and his friends were fine, and it was all thanks to Douglas. The assassin was being pursued by the military police, but it didn't look like they had found him. The guest house lady continued that the military police wanted to ask Douglas about the dark man. The man looked at her in surprise and asked again. He replied that they were interested in who he was and the circumstances of the attack. In general, it seemed that they wanted Douglas to share his knowledge, and now they were watching the house. She apologized, but offered to call them. Douglas smiled awkwardly and thought about how he had virtually no information about this man. The only thing he knew was that he was an assassin, and that his target was Rafi. At that moment, the girl grabbed her father's hand. At the same time, she began to tremble violently. Robbie stood thoughtfully next to Douglas, waiting for him to start talking. The man glanced at her furtively and began to speak. First, he apologized and said that although the wound had healed, he was exhausted after what had happened. He thought about meeting the military police tomorrow. The owner of the guest house agreed. Suddenly, she remembered something. She said that after returning, Baron Morse found out about everything that Carlos had done. This shocked the man. The lady continued that from now on he would have to accompany the Baron on all his travels. She was sure that under his father's constant supervision he would no longer be able to cause any kind of trouble. The girl added that she also informed the Baron about Douglas's intention to meet him. The man smiled and said that he was now her debtor. He was pleased to hear that, but he would not be able to meet Baron Morse. The man turned to Ravi, all because he wanted her to tell the military police about that man. The girl turned around in confusion. She still didn't understand what he wanted from her. Douglas said that he hadn't expressed himself that way. He had meant that she shouldn't do it. The man tried to explain that she simply had to say if she was against it. That would be enough for him. Ravi was silent for a while and said that she was scared. Douglas immediately suggested that she run away. The girl looked at the man seriously and did not understand what was happening. Douglas said he would write a letter not to disturb Madam and the others after they had left. In the meantime, Ravi should get ready. Ravi listened carefully to her father, who was telling them to slip away from the sight of the military police. There were several people standing outside. Douglas was watching them from behind the door, trying to figure out how to get through without being seen by the military police. Suddenly, a voice came from behind them which scared the people who were about to leave, and this voice asked them to wait. It was Veronica, who asked them to stop acting so unfriendly. The man looked at the girl with a puzzled expression, and she loudly announced that they were here. She also added that the girl was nearby. The military police laughed at him because he thought they wouldn't notice. Madam turned to Douglas, saying that perhaps they should. A cart pulled up to the house. It was the man who delivered alcohol and food to them every evening. Madam had already spoken to the coachman, and he would take them to the outskirts of the city. Douglas said that she would then be drawn into it. Madam interrupted him and told him to leave it to her. After all, Douglas was the guardian, and he should always choose the safest way. The woman clarified this with him, that she was right. He agreed. Ravi could have been taken into custody, but thanks to Douglas, the girls in the guest house can now work safely. Madam added to her words that they would carefully use the flowers he made for them, and wished them to take care of themselves. Carlos thanked him for saving him that time. He would never forget their kindness. The girl said that it was the first time she had met such a kind person like him, and asked to be allowed to express her gratitude the next time they came. At the same time, she added that, of course, together with this little girl. At the same time, the girl put a flower behind the girl's ear. Rabi began to straighten it and smile. The girl smiled too. Someone came up to him and said that he still didn't know if he should have continued living. However, he was going to think about it seriously now, because he would no longer be angry about his past, and he would look to the future and find something to do. It was Veronica who smiled and said that when the day comes, they will meet again, and she will be able to say with pride that they have not seen each other for a long time. The family in the card happily agreed with her, for the few days they had spent with them had been very cheerful. They had been shouted after to take care of themselves, and they had hoped that they would meet Douglas and Ravi again. The man and his daughter lived happily at the house in which they had spent several days, moving away. And then, as darkness fell, they drove out of the city. And finally, the boys got out of the cart. The cart drove away, and Douglas and Ravi continued their journey along the wide roads lined with trees. In the dead of night, only the quiet steps of two people could be heard. The man said that everything would be all right with them now. The next big city they would go to would be Balzac, and they would have to accept the fact that there would be no soft bed for the foreseeable future. The girl sadly agreed. Through the broad crowns of trees, illuminated by the moon, the two figures continued walking along a path. Robbie thought about it and apologized to her father. Because of her, they had to leave the city in a hurry. She also mentioned the dark man. She knew she had to tell about him, but she was afraid to talk, and it was hard. Douglas thought he hadn't said that she shouldn't force herself to talk. Ravi grabbed her clothes and started denying that she was dangerous for her father, and if he stayed with her, many bad things could happen, and all because she was a cursed child. The dark people came to use her as bait for demons. The girl began to cry and her face showed many emotions. Douglas repeated her words about the cursed child, and he wondered what she meant by the dark people and assumed that they were destroyers. The girl began to shake, which frightened the man. He immediately began to support her, saying that everything was fine and she should stop worrying. Ravi wanted to object, but the man interrupted her, saying that he was glad that the girl had decided to open her heart to him. However, he did not want her to force herself. Douglas said she shouldn't feel guilty about keeping secrets. She should just let him listen when he wanted to open up, and he would accept whatever she had to say. Ravi turned to her father with relief. She was silent for a moment, then smiled and said that she agreed, thanking him. The man saw that it was a forced smile, because on the day they first met, Ravi had said she had nowhere to go back to. So he promised her he would take her to Balzac and find someone there to take care of her. However, he wondered if Ravi really thought she would be watched, even though they hadn't dealt with the exterminator incident yet. Douglas turned to the girl, saying that she planned to disappear after he left her with someone Balzac. The girl was shocked and opened her mouth in surprise. The man realized that it was true after all, and considering that Ravi wouldn't hurt a fly, he couldn't imagine her dragging anyone into a situation like this. For her to have to carry everything on her back, even though she was so scared right now. The man looked down and knelt down to be on the same level with her. He apologized to her and asked her to let him say what he always wanted to say. This surprised the girl. Douglas said he would put Ravi in someone's care after they got to Balzac, but he takes it back though. He had been thinking about it all along. Long journeys were not suitable for a small child. She should be able to live in a peaceful city with children her own age. Douglas was sure that she would learn many things that he could not teach her, and he decided to start by saying that he was just a middle-aged wandering man, and he didn't know how you raise children, and he didn't have the slightest idea what girls felt, but he wanted her to be happy. And finally, he asked her, or rather, he wanted Ravi to become a real part of his family. The girl opened her mouth in surprise, and her eyes widened and she took a very deep breath. She stammered that if he stayed with her, Dad would get in trouble. Douglas said he would be fine. He wanted to hear what Ravi herself wanted. The girl grabbed her clothes again and said, feeling complete sadness, that she really wanted to be with her father always. Douglas said that then, whoever the enemy was, he would definitely protect her. She shouldn't worry about it because he would definitely make Ravi the happiest girl in the world. Ravi burst into tears and turned to her father once more. Suddenly, she jumped into his arms to hug him tightly. Douglas smiled and hugged her back. On this day, they became a real family. One journey came to an end, and a new life began for a middle-aged man and his beloved daughter, Ravi. They walked along the path, that same night, which was already coming to an end, and held hands, because now they were happy. And the next city they were heading to was the megalopolis, Balzac. The wind continued to blow. Footsteps were heard. Something on the ground began to glow brightly. Ravi looked ahead in delight and thought it was ice. Douglas laughed and said that it definitely looked like ice, but still, it was a stone, namely white limestone. The girl opened her mouth in surprise. The beauty of the stone fascinated her. They found themselves in a cave and simultaneously said that it was beautiful here. The man said that the place is called a limestone cave, namely a cave formed from limestone that is washed away over time by rain, groundwater, and other water resources. Ravi repeated his words and was surprised that the water had washed away such a big hole. Her father confirmed and added that it took countless long years for this to happen. The girl continued to look at the limestone rock and thought it was amazing, and Douglas looked at her with a genuine smile. Later, he suggested that they take a short break here. He also suggested that they brew some herbal tea that they had bought from Theo's grandfather's shop. Ravi wanted to make sure that he was sure that he wanted to do this. He confirmed and said that since he was so far from Milton, they no longer needed to hurry. Suddenly, a loud roar was heard in the cave, which frightened Douglas, and he immediately covered his daughter with his hands. He thought about the fact that these were falling rocks. He also wanted to check what was there just in case, and invited Ravi to follow him. She agreed without hesitation because she was very scared. Douglas called for light, and the ball of light now illuminated the area they were standing in. Well, strange sounds began to come from the darkness. In the distance, an incomprehensible silhouette was visible, from which strange sounds were emitted. It was a huge bird, which was looking straight at the boys. The bird again emitted strange sounds, still continuing to look at them. Douglas did not expect to see a tricolor garo, a magical bird that is a rare species. It was a beauty that could be seen even in the dark. But he did not understand why this bird looked a little different. Ravi noticed that the bird was injured and pointed at some object. It was clear that it was the sound of falling rocks, and he was going to heal her right now. Douglas used full healing, and the bird immediately raised its head. It began to rise on its feet, and the man continued to hold the hand with healing to heal it completely. The bird began to glow, and two people watched it closely. Douglas's mouth dropped open in surprise because the bird didn't have three colors. It was rainbow. The bird looked up and continued to make sounds. It took off, emitting all the colors of the rainbow and illuminating the entire cave with its light. Douglas thought that this bird was incomparable, and perhaps it was a new species that had evolved on its own in this cave. Ravi was glad that she was now healthy. She turned to her father and said she had the same feeling as when he had saved her. Douglas squatted and watched his daughter, who was watching the bird fly away in fascination. The man smiled seeing Ravi so happy, because it had been a month and a half since he had met Ravi. In other words, if we say at least 4 months had passed since he had left Balzac. At that time, before he formally joined the group with Alon and the others, there was a time when he was traveling with them. Douglas remembered saying that before they left, there was something he wanted to ask them. He wanted to know what if a wild monster appeared in front of them, but the monster was peaceful and not hostile. In that case, how would they act, and what would they do? The people he was addressing didn't understand what he was talking about, because there are no peaceful monsters. One of them thought Douglas was saying that they should be merciful to monsters. The last of the 4 boys said that, in that case, he was wrong, because all 4 wanted to destroy the monster for the sake of the future. He was pulled out of his memories by Robbie, who distracted him because she found a feather from a bird that had flown away. The girl was happily holding a long, colorful feather in her hands and said that it seemed like she had thanked them. Douglas was silent. He thought about the fact that tomorrow they would arrive in Balzac, and if they were still in the city, then he would be able to return this ring to Alan, which was a reminder of his parents and the catalyst for his curse. And to be honest, he also thought that he wouldn't be able to sort out his feelings, because he was sure that they wouldn't be happy to see him again. Douglas looked at his hand, and there was one thing. But because he needed to move on, in his hand was Alan's ring, which he wanted to return to him. They arrived in the city, and Douglas didn't understand what was going on, because there were panels on the streets with him and Ravi in their arms, and there were masks with his face on people on the street. Then he noticed the sweets that had his face on them too. Voices were heard everywhere, and Douglas didn't understand what all the fuss was about. Robbie said that the cookies with her dad's face were cute. He asked him not to touch them. Suddenly, people began to recognize Douglas and exclaim his name. Everyone did not expect his return. And finally, the townspeople began to joyfully shout that Douglas had returned. Robbie was very scared and jumped on her father's neck. He, in turn, still did not understand what was happening here. Someone shouted that this was the strongest adventurer guardian and wanted to know what he thought, seeing the title of his article. The man said he was a reporter from the publishing department of the Kashimashi Magic Printing House. He shouted out the word mirror. He was curious how it all went, because thanks to his articles, the whole city is now talking about him. And on the front page of tomorrow's suburban newspaper will be the return of the adventurer's strongest guardian. He kept shouting, trying to find out what he thought about it, because newspaper sales would surely skyrocket again. Douglas looked at him in complete shock, and Ravi, who was sitting on his arms, was scared. The reporter shouted for him to tell him about his travels. Some people paid attention to the adventurer's daughter and realized that she was the one because of whom he became a guardian. Someone exclaimed that such light hair was rare. Douglas started apologizing because his daughter was getting scared, and he asked everyone to move away. Ravi, at this point, pressed herself more and more tightly to her father's shoulder, trying to hide from so many people. People kept shouting for his autograph, because someone was a close friend of his, or a guy who had sat next to him in a tavern one time. Douglas knew that these people had no shame or conscience. Things were bad, and he needed to get out of here now. He turned to the power of charm, asking it to veil reality and puzzle the people standing before him. He used an illusion and smoke immediately appeared round him. Robbie liked it and was amazed. The smoke began to completely cover them from head to toe and eventually obscured them from people's sight. The people did not understand what was happening, and when the smoke cleared, they were surprised to see that it had disappeared. Some realized that this was one of Douglas's skills and were amazed that they had seen something like this for the first time. The reporter continued to say that this had never happened before, and their legendary hero not only returned, but even demonstrated his skills. He told everyone that the newspaper had a record of all the events of the day and sold them for 2 copper coins. But at that very moment, the reporter fell and was trampled because they were looking for the adventurer with his daughter, and they wanted to make him show more. At the same time, people were shouting his name and trying to get to him faster. At the same time, on the empty street, Ravi tried to see her father, and touching the air, she addressed him. He immediately answered that he used illusion skills to hide their bodies, so they quickly ran away. He was sure that she couldn't see him now, and asked for forgiveness for this, but asked to be patient a little longer. The girl agreed, and at that time, loud footsteps from invisible people were heard along the deserted street. In any case, he was very sorry because he scared her. The girl said that everything was fine, and besides, she was glad that her dad was popular. Douglas was surprised by this, and said that although he had heard about the newspaper article in Noton, he could not have imagined what it would all lead to. After all, the people in Balzac were just making a fuss out of their own curiosity. But in any case, it would be a problem if they didn't calm down. But he didn't understand how they would survive this turmoil. Ravi said she thought they could disguise themselves. Douglas asked again, and they immediately ran to a shop. The same doorbell rang, and the man behind the counter said, "Welcome." But at that moment, the seller started shaking his head in search of a customer. And at that moment, Douglas and Ravi appeared in front of her face, apologizing to her and saying that they were here. The girl was very scared and started rocking on her chair. There was a crash as the salesman fell off his chair. Douglas leaned over the counter to see if she was okay. The girl on the floor started laughing and saying she was glad to see him. She said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and she was happy to see that he was still alive. After all, there hadn't been a day recently that she hadn't heard rumors about him. She noticed the girl next to him and thought that she was his daughter. Ravi introduced herself and said that she was pleased to meet her. The saleswoman responded in kind. She was also pleased to meet her. The same saleswoman got down to business. She was interested in what he needed today. Douglas was glad that she immediately got down to business and said that the truth was that they needed a disguise. The girl immediately grabbed the curtains, understanding everything without him. It made sense because he couldn't walk down the street in peace now. She offered him hats or wigs in other cases. Ravi helped too and handed her father a mustache. The girl at the cash register said it was very sweet of her. The girl in glasses also said that they had other things and offered Douglas to try them on. He readily agreed. A completely different person appeared in front of the mirror. He had a mustache, a wig, a hat, and completely different clothes. The saleswoman said he looked great, and he looked like his crazy musician grandfather. Ravi said, scared, that he wasn't Dad. Douglas looked at her a little sadly and thought about it. The man noticed some flasks on the table and asked the saleswoman what they were. She replied that it was a magic device that allowed you to change your hair color for 24 hours. And unfortunately for him, they only have the one that changes to black, so there's no point in him using it. But she immediately realized that it could help Ravi. But she wanted to know if he was sure that he didn't want to disguise her. Douglas replied that he didn't want her to have to hide. The man thought about it because she had been called by name before and told that she had beautiful blonde hair. And he would like to think that people would not chase after such a little girl. Ravi looked at her hair and turned to her father, who immediately looked at her. She said that if she uses it, she will have the same hair color as her father. Douglas blushed and Lola put her hand to her mouth in embarrassment. The man turned to the saleswoman and said that he would take it. She thanked him. He wanted to know if she knew where Alan's group was. The girl understood that he wanted to see them. The man immediately said that wasn't the case. He hadn't tried to contact them to get back into the group. Lola laughed and said that wasn't what she meant. She thought he felt better not having to deal with the heroes group. After all, he looked happier. But alas, they missed each other. The group was in Balzac until they disappeared a few days ago. Until the corner, he thought that she wanted to say that they went to finish off the Demon King. Lola said that it was unlikely, and apparently the guild hasn't received any requests to subdue the Demon King yet. And right now, the only rumors are that they've fallen into despair and had to flee. Personally, she was definitely relieved that they were gone. Douglas asked her again because he was so surprised by her answer. She said that they had become the source of all sorts of bad news. It happened shortly after Douglas left. Dario from the Heroes team started to accumulate debts everywhere, which made everyone hate him, and the merchants found themselves in a difficult situation. The man was very surprised that he had problems with money. This is because, even though they have been taking requests lately, they have been failing all the time. The supplies they've been using are quite expensive. That is why it has ended up being a big financial loss for everyone. Lola said that was probably one of the reasons for the disagreement. The team was on the verge of falling apart. Douglas opened his mouth wide and screamed because he couldn't believe his ears. But the girl continued and said that it was Dario's mistake that was to blame. He acted like a leader and insisted on what was beneficial to him, and also insisted on transforming the team with an emphasis on attack. She also heard that Dario told Alan to kick Fanny out, because she specializes in healing and can't help in an attack. The team of the hero, Alan, when a man was still part of it, consisted of the sage Edmund and the healer Fanny in the rear guard, and him, the sorcerer, the hero Alan, as well as the kamikaze swordsman Dario in the vanguard. Douglas said that he had of course heard about Dario's claims to Fanny at the time, but such a person was needed on the team. Lola said that he was right, but unfortunately Dario got drunk and in a fit of rage shouted that Fanny was useless, which angered Alan, who promptly expelled him. He didn't want to be chosen. He got into a fight with Alan, and it all turned into a violent quarrel. It was terrible. Douglas stood there in bewilderment and repeated her words, and it turned out that what they heard in the carriage back then was about this. Even though everyone had united together in the past to defeat the Demon King, every team needs a kind person to resolve conflicts. Lola continued and said that they hadn't brushed aside something so important. It was obvious that even if things went well at first, they would gradually go wrong. Douglas thought about the good man. Lola confirmed his thoughts, that when they brushed him off, Alan's group began to fall apart. It was this Douglas who didn't need to worry about anything. The man thanked her and fell into thought again. That could be true, but he still doesn't know anything about the curse, if that's the reason. Interrupting his thoughts, Ravi pulled her father's clothes, because she thought that these people were hurting her father. Ravi puffed out her cheeks and Douglas started laughing. And eventually he turned to Lola again, because she had just spoken as if a lot had happened. And he wanted to know some more news besides Dario. The girl said that there was about Alan. Douglas was interested in this information. The girl said that there were a lot of rumors and she was not sure what was real and what was not. The rumor said that he was sick or weak. The guy looked pale and his eyes were empty and he clearly did not seem normal. The man took up her words and thought that after that, he was lost. But the last time they saw each other, he had noticed nothing of the sort, and now he was interested in what had happened in the last few months. But now in the tavern the night singing of the piglet the next day, at the table sat Douglas and Ravi. The man came out from behind the counter, creaking the door. It was Ikub who owned the inn. He apologized for not being able to show up yesterday. He took the opportunity to drop in after a long time. Dukley turned to the innkeeper, asking for forgiveness for stopping there so suddenly. He would try to be careful not to cause a stir. Ikub said he could stay as long as he wanted, although it has now become a source of inconvenience to the townspeople. At the moment when he became famous, a crowd of dubious friends of Douglas filled the streets. The man laughed at this description of himself. At that moment, someone from behind the door announced that he was home. Diana, who was Ikub's daughter, stood at the door. She greeted Ravi very happily, and she in turn greeted Diana happily. Ikeb's daughter said it was raining heavily outside and she wondered if it would clear up tomorrow. Douglas's daughter said it would be nice if it did. Behind the counter, the girls' fathers watched them with genuine smiles. Ikeb heard about this and said that he must be glad that he now had a family to love. Douglas cheerfully confirmed this. Ravi is shy with strangers, so he was worried about whether she would get along with Ehab's daughter. But over time, She seemed to be open to establishing relationships in real life. In any case, Douglas was glad that Robbie had managed to make friends with someone her own age. Voices were heard on the stairs, and ICAB said that it seemed that their guests were coming down. He asked Diana to call her mother. She agreed. Douglas said that it was time for them to go then too, and began to disguise himself, asking Ravi to get that powder. ICAB did not understand what kind of outfit this was, and Diana began to laugh out loud. There were many people in the dining room, talking about something of their own. Ravi's hair was black as night and a beautiful bow was tied on it. She turned to her father, and he wanted to know what was going on. The family was sitting at dinner, and Ravi wanted to know if they would go to another city from here or not. Douglas thought about it because this was a temporary place, and since they were constantly traveling, it had become normal for her that they did not stay in one place. From now on, he would live with Ravi, and whether they would continue to travel or live a family life and settle down, they had to decide. He wanted to know from Ravi what she wanted, travel or city life. The girl did not know what to answer and finally looked at her father. He said that by continuing to travel, she would be able to meet a variety of people and discover many new things for herself, which was what made her attractive. On the other hand, with a home, you will have a place to return to and a sense of security that will allow you to lead a carefree life. Besides that, there is a person, the hero Alan, whom he mentioned several times because he has something important for him. If possible, he wants to return it personally, because he may not return to this city, so he asked her to be patient. Robbie agreed, and Douglas said that in that case, he asked her to think about what to do during this time, and also to decide together what they should do next. Robbie happily agreed. Suddenly a box approached them, and this attracted the attention of Douglas and Ravi. Diana suddenly climbed out of the box and turned to Ravi. Douglas's daughter did not understand why Ikev's daughter was hiding, and she was told to stay out of sight. Diana, sitting under the box, suggested that Ravi go play as soon as everything was cleared up tomorrow. She waited for Ravi to answer, who wasn't sure if Diana was ready. She happily agreed. Ravi realized something and started apologizing to Diana because she thought it would be better at home. Diana said that then they would play with dolls tomorrow. Diana waved and climbed back under the box. Douglas and his daughter waved back. The man was thinking about something and wanted to know from his daughter that she wanted to play with Diana outside. Ravi agreed, but she remembered that something dangerous had happened before, namely that terrible fight with the assassin. So she changed her mind and discarded the thought. Douglas realized she was talking about the incident with the destroyer. By that logic, it was easy for him to protect her and forbid her from going out to play. But it would be bad to continue to invade her privacy. He wants to do something about it because he has finally become friends with her after all. Night has come and Ravi is already fast asleep. The tavern is still crowded. Ikeb looks away, passing a drink to a customer. He approached Douglas, offering him a drink. But the man said that everything was fine. He was just thinking about something. Ikeb thought that something was bothering him. Douglas replied that it was nothing special. He was just wondering if there was a way to safely pass the time. Even if Ravi was attacked by the destroyer while he was not around, Ikeb asked mockingly about the destroyer, thinking that he was overdoing it with concern. Douglas was extremely serious and looked at the table. There were all sorts of magical devices on the table. Douglas thought it would be nice if there was some kind of magical device that could protect Ravi in his absence. Ideally, it would be to get a cuckoo. Ikeb thought he meant a magical anti-crime cuckoo. Douglas confirmed, saying it would warn of danger and repel it immediately, and was the perfect magical device to protect children in the absence of their parents. Ikeb said he was overdoing it, and it was a device to protect important people. Not to mention how unique they are, and there are only a handful of craftsmen who can make them. Douglas said there is one place that knows about it. The man was shocked by what Douglas was trying to do. Because he was planning to go to the Balzac shop of magical instruments, also known as the secret shop of magical instruments. Douglas said that he would be back soon. Magical tools made by craftsmen are support items that enable adventurers to manifest various effects. Balzac's shop of magical instruments, known for dealing in items of particularly rare quality. It is the most famous shop of magical instruments in the country. Douglas walked through the deserted area and thought that, however, this shop itself chooses its customers. In front of him were two pillars, or rather two totems. Douglas ran his hand along one of them and addressed the gatekeeper, asking him to wake up and accept his challenge. a column of smoke began to appear behind the gate. A voice emerged from the pillar, surprised by the client's appearance at such a late hour. And only select warriors can pass through his summoning gate. So the voice asked him to prove to him that he had the power. Douglas was relaxed and said that the gatekeeper was casting unique magic to test those who hoped to enter the shop, and only those who passed the tests he had prepared could enter. He remembered that last time there were many legionarians, and now a squad of golems awaited him. The gate corrected him, saying that these were not simple golems, but 100 of demonic minerals, which are strong even among unique minerals. And if he was going to escape, then now was the time, because the fist power released by such a body was not comparable to that of an ordinary golem. Douglas entered the battle and thanked the gate for the warning, and jumped away from the stones that had already been destroyed by 100 golems. He summoned a magical barrier. The gate realized that it was a magical barrier, and said that the golem's attacks were physical attacks and magic like this would not work on them. Suddenly, a barrier appeared on the pillars, and the voice did not understand what had happened. They wanted to know what he was doing, but Douglas said that the barrier was not to protect him, but to protect the gate from his attack. The voice from the gate said that he looked closely and saw that he was Douglas. Without letting the gate finish, he said that his daughter was waiting for him, so he wanted to give it his all. He used fire magic and the salamander spell, and at that moment, the whole sky was lit up with fire, and Douglas's face was full of confidence. The man held his hand in one position to increase the fire's power. The fire continued to spread to the golems, destroying them one by one. There was a roar, and the 100 golems were reduced to a pile of charred coals. Douglas exhaled and said that he had succeeded. The voice from the gate called him an imp because he had not thought that anyone would pass his test so quickly. In addition, the gate thanked him for putting a barrier on them, and a glow began to appear in the center, with the emblem of this store. The person on the other side didn't understand who had passed the challenge gate the fastest in history. It was unprecedented. If they were passed so easily, wouldn't the store's good name be damaged? Douglas greeted the owner, saying that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. In front of him stood Esther and Carrie, who were the owners of Balzac's magical instrument shop. They were surprised that it was Douglas. They all started shaking their heads at the same time, amazed by his strength. The girls were starting to lose confidence, but knowing it was Douglas, they could accept it. Only idiots had been coming here lately. They also thought he had lost his card. Douglas said he had it with him, but how could they see that it had expired? Because it had been 3 years. The girls immediately set about restoring the expiration date. The card lit up, and Douglas looked up. Letters began to appear from the card upwards. This shop was truly mesmerizing, and it was enough to just look at it. Next time he planned to bring Rabi here, because he was sure she would like it here. They handed him a card. Esther told him to just show the card to the gate next time to get in. Carrie thought he was just there to renew his membership card, or maybe to buy something. Douglas said he would do the shopping another day, and he decided to find out if they had any magical anti-crime cuckoos, and he wanted to know the price. The girls told him that he would have to order one, but they could get one, and by the way, it was very expensive, 100 gold coins. The price could cover a mansion. Douglas thought about it, because he had no choice but to take on a few high-paying quests anyway. Still, it was a small price to pay for protecting Ravi. He asked the girls to book him, and he would come back later. The girls would do everything, and now a figure has appeared on the deserted street. Who is in a hurry to take high-paying tasks that could be started as soon as possible tomorrow? Suddenly, someone appeared in front of him, shouting about a powerful explosion in the wastelands, and he kept wondering if he was running here for nothing. It was a tired reporter. He was glad that he had finally found Douglas. It was he, the mirror from Kahimashi's magical printing house. The reporter realized that he had gone to Balzac's shop of magical instruments and had even broken through the gate of summoning. The reporter had expected nothing less from him. Douglas had let his guard down because it was the middle of the night. However, now was the time. He was going to take this opportunity to tell her the truth. He asked for forgiveness, and also asked her to stop chasing him. Because of his physique, he could no longer hide from the townspeople, which was causing him trouble. The reporter didn't know what he was talking about, because he didn't even know how special he was. Douglas Ford was one of a kind, and isn't that why he was so popular? People started waking up and looking out of their windows, noticing Douglas. The reporter asked him for an exclusive interview. And if he did, he would understand how much the townspeople loved him. And one day, he would have handshaking and autographing events and even a parade with the whole town. Douglas was shocked by his words, especially after the reporter mentioned the parade. But he went on to say that, come to think of it, he had asked to see the paper since that day, and it had been received with great interest. Douglas said he was very sorry. The reporter turned around in confusion, and Douglas, running away, shouted that he didn't want anything like that. The reporter asked him to wait for him, or at least give his autograph. Many people ran out of their houses to see the idol, and only one dark figure looked at the scrap of newspaper, where Douglas was in close-up with a girl in his arms. The next day came. The streets were still empty and deserted. Only one door in the tavern slammed and frequent steps began to be heard on the stairs, hurrying somewhere. Douglas and Ravi arrived at a place, and they were told that they were just in time. Douglas thought he had mentioned that he would come here today. The man who was sitting and stroking his beard said that it was obvious when he came here. His ears were sharp as always. Then and now. It was Ham who was the informant, namely, the dwarf. Douglas said that Ham still did not change because he was his old friend. Selling information for money and acting as a middleman in quests that are not standard guild business is his main job, but he has information that others do not. He also has enough influence to take over a country. Douglas asked about his business. Ham replied that he was gathering information, of course, but the brokering quests weren't very good. There were simply too few adventurers to count on for special tasks. Ham realized that Douglas was looking for a high-paying quest. If he agreed to accept, he had several problematic quests he would like to recommend. Douglas apologized, saying that he should have told him beforehand. Douglas just didn't mind if the pay wasn't too high. He asked for some safe work, because he didn't want to get into trouble anymore. Ham figured there was nothing he could do about it. After all, he now had someone to protect. But now, however, it came to that. He let go of the pen he was writing with, and it continued writing on its own. And something caught Ham's attention, so he asked him to wait a second because he had just received a new assignment. Ravi thought he was her dad going to work. Douglas confirmed and said she would go with him, and they might have to leave Balzac for a few days, depending on the assignment, but they would be back as soon as they were done. Douglas also said that he could go and play with Diana later. This made Ravi so happy that she beamed and couldn't believe what her father had told her. Ham sat smiling and watched the interaction between father and daughter. Suddenly, he said that he had the most suitable one. He did not know how to express his thought correctly. In the end, he said that no one was suitable for this quest except Douglas. At this, the man threw a piece of paper on the table. This was a quest from a rich man, and the reward was good. A huge 50 gold coins. Douglas thought that the reward was too good to just find someone. But he was worried about kidnapping because it is not safe. Ham said it wasn't a kidnapping. The mission was to find a tycoon's daughter who had run away from home. From Ham's explanation, it was the tycoon Tolkien and his daughter Bridget who had run away from home a few days ago. Bridget was 17 years old, and this was her second escape. And according to Tolkien's secretary, the quest giver, it seemed like they were arguing regularly. All that was left was to find his daughter and bring her home, and that was the quest. But, still, if her whereabouts had been unknown for several days, then Douglas would have a fair amount of ground to search. Ham said it looked like she was near town. Douglas realized that even if she was nearby, she couldn't be found. Ham replied that that was the point, because it looked like his daughter had hired someone with the illusion skill. The man realized that this would complicate things. After all, the skill he used in the city earlier to hide him and Ravi with the illusion skill. Just like the curse, in order to interfere with the cast spell and then cancel it, extremely advanced methods are used. Ham said that for this reason, finding his daughter was impossible for an ordinary adventurer. And he decided to say that before the matter was handed over to him. A person from the Adventurers Guild took on the task, but was soon dismissed. Douglas couldn't understand how this had happened. Ham explained that he had been lucky enough to find her and knock her out to take her home. His daughter had woken up halfway and eventually ran away, which had failed him. But apparently, the magnate got angry at the adventurer and made him go through hell. Because after all, any father would get angry if his beloved daughter suffered. Ham pointed his finger at Douglas and said that he was the best at this. After all, harming his daughter is forbidden, and this time the task involves bringing his daughter home. And if the man does take on the job, he can start with the toy berry. Ham will prepare the ship, and he must find out the details. Ravi was excited to make sure they would be sailing on the boat. Douglas confirmed and said that the toy berry was a tourist attraction known for its beautiful beaches. And if there was any free time, Douglas suggested that Ravi go swimming together, because it had been getting hot lately, so it should be great. Ravi happily agreed. Ham looked at the two happy people and smiled. Ham said that everything was decided then, and he would contact them, and the departure would be tomorrow. At that very second, a man jumped down from somewhere above. He landed on the floor, startling everyone in the room. Douglas jumped up from his seat, trying to protect Ravi. Someone knew, because even when they were together, whenever it came to solo work, Douglas came here. He made sure that he returned to the city and also found his powers again. In front of Douglas stood Dario, who asked Ham to give him this quest too, and offered to raise easy money. Dario was a former member of the Heroes group and is also a kamikaze swordsman. There were two dark figures on the embankment. The city was pitch dark. Dario sat on a rock and was surprised that Douglas had come. The man wished him a good morning and said that they needed to hurry. Finally, the men began to walk along the embankment, and in Douglas's arms lay a sleeping Ravi. The man looked at his former comrade and smiled imperceptibly. Their conversation was not going well. One said that it was cool now. The other answered with indifference that it probably was. One tried to get the other to talk again, trying to find out where the harbor was. The other answered with indifference that that was why they were still walking. Douglas walked along smiling, feeling awkward. After all, since it was so important to act together as a group, he never had much of a chance to talk to them individually, including, perhaps because of those rumors about Dario. It is inevitable that he is uncomfortable working with him. And this quest to find the runaway daughter, will everything really be okay? In any case, he needed to start a conversation. He was trying to get Dario to talk and wanted to know what had happened recently, because he heard that he had left the hero group. As soon as he said that, Dario stopped. Douglas thought he had said something wrong again, and that made Dario laugh. He immediately said that his habit of speaking delicately every time in an awkward situation had not improved at all. Douglas smiled awkwardly. Birds were flying in the sky. Douglas heard that he had a big fight with Alan. Dario confirmed and said that they kept failing even quests that didn't involve the Demon King. So he abandoned the group. Douglas wanted to confirm this, because he heard that Dario was angry because he did not want to be exiled. Dario said that he did not say that, and also said that these were dirty rumors based on blind faith. Douglas immediately apologized, but had decided to clarify something else, namely material well-being. Dario said that it was true that he had little money. After all, he gets a new weapon, but it inevitably breaks easily. Besides, ever since he left the group, the shops were always asking if he could pay, and then he couldn't put it on his account, even if he never returned it. Dario said that was when he knew Douglas was in town, and it was luck. And that's all that matters. Douglas's face instantly changed. Still, it seemed like he was talking normally. He always seemed to hate him to the core. Dario turned around and said that was it. This confused Douglas. Dario said that the hero group is a special group of selected people with talent. Just being in it gives you the right to quests, great trust, and rewards. However, the old man was terribly weak and too pitiful to look at in his later years. And that is why, even though he could have simply retired, his desire to curry favor with the group of heroes looked like he was trying to hold them back. Dario was disappointed to see Douglas, their former leader, in such a state. However, he was now healthy and no longer had any debts. In that case, he had no reason to hate him. The man was surprised by his frankness. The boy replied that he was not the wise man Edmund, but he was interested in why he had become weak. Douglas wondered whether he should tell him about it, but he realized that he probably shouldn't keep it a secret. He hugged Ravi tighter and started telling him that the truth was that Alan had cursed him. Dario turned around and started laughing heartily. Dario's stomach hurt from laughing because the cold expression on his face was so cruel. He didn't understand what he had done to deserve this. Douglas himself didn't know why he had done it. Dario had tears in his eyes and wondered what he was planning to do. Douglas was surprised, and the guy asked him not to play dumb. Because he came back here specifically, wasn't he, to beat everything out of Alan? But Douglas's answer did not match Dario's opinion, because he had no such intention, and he just wanted to return the ring to him. The guy told him to just go to the guild and leave it there, and he would not give a satisfactory answer of his own free will. Douglas thought about it, and said he just wanted to chat, like he would ask why he did it and whether he had a grudge against him. But he was relieved not to have run into Alan. He doubted that he should meet him. Suddenly, in his arms, Ravi woke up and began to stretch, and Douglas wished her good morning. She said the same in response and looked at Dario, who was displeased. Ravi started remembering all the moments with him and looked at her father questioningly. Dario said that she looked like a doll. Douglas did not expect this and said that she was his charming daughter. Dario thought that he had become stupid along with her. At that very moment, they began to be called. It was a half-dragon, half-human, who was calling them to him. Because he had heard everything from Ham, and he just needed to get them to Toyberry, the man introduced himself, saying that his name was Viaggio, and that he was the captain of this ship. Douglas said that was correct, and that was why he had to take care of them. Dario pointed out with displeasure that it was a large lizard. Douglas tried to calm him down, but then Ravi called him a lizard too. So he started to apologize, but the lizard laughed and said that everything was fine and that it was just baby talk. Viaggio said they could leave, and the anchor began to rise, and the ship began to sail. Ravi looked at the sea and was completely delighted by what was happening. They were greeted by the sun, which was beginning to rise. Ravi stood with her arms outstretched and a wide smile, and behind her stood Douglas, who was watching his daughter. The lizard realized that she was on the ship for the first time. The girl confirmed it, and Viaggio said that she should be happy then. But suddenly he wanted to know how things were with food. Douglas thought that there was food on the ship, but Viaggio said it was all right, because Toyberry was about half a day's walk along the coast. And they might catch some fish. Ravi realized that he was going to catch fish using a net. The lizard said that it was good for rivers, but it would not work at such a distance, and asked her to wait, and she would be able to see everything for herself. The lizard stuck out its tongue, which surprised Ravi and Douglas. With its tongue, the lizard began to catch fish in the sea, and eventually, it began to throw them on board, and now he thought that this should have been enough. Ravi admired the fact that there were so many fish here. Douglas was also amazed by such an amazing technique. Viaggio started to smile, and said that this was his one and only specialty, and he turned to Douglas, realizing that he could use magic, because they could eat it raw, and they needed to destroy the parasites. But he also heard the precise control of magic is tiring, and if he wants, he can freeze the entire box. Douglas tried to find out if this would work, and the lizard turned around and opened his mouth in surprise, because he clearly did not expect this. The fish was carefully frozen, which amazed the lizards. Douglas, a little upset, said that he had some experience in this. The lizard said that he would defrost it now, and they had to be patient in the meantime. He even had something to season it with. Viaggio came out with the fish on a tray, saying he had it all ready, and he said it had to look good. The tray was filled with neatly cut pieces. Everyone was in high anticipation, but their hopes were dashed when Viaggio brought raw fish. Dario said he had never eaten anything like it. Ravi doubted it was edible, but there was sauce next to the fish, and Douglas was interested in it. The lizard explained that it was soy sauce, and it was like when they fermented the grains. And the thing was, his older brother was trading with a country in the east, and they sold it to them, saying it was a local dish. Ravi noticed that it was black. Viaggio thought that they didn't like it because if they preferred it cooked, the lizard didn't finish because Dario grabbed a piece and dipped it in the sauce. He put it in his mouth, which surprised Douglas and Ravi. Suddenly, Dario's face changed and he opened his mouth because it was just delicious. The boys said that this sweet and salty taste was wonderful. The lizard told him to take more, calling him a kid. Dario exclaimed that he was not a child. Ravi and Douglas looked at each other, holding forks in their hands. They took and tried one piece. The girl said that it was delicious, and her father felt an unusual taste. And it was delicious. The lizard said that he actually had other spices, and there was one green one. Dario said that it was spicy, and the captain was told that it was too early for children. there was a scorching sun that was already hanging right above them. The ship was sailing in the right direction, and the waves were beating against the side of the ship. And Dario was sitting, leaning against the side. The ship was creaking. Dario was displeased with the pitching because there was a possibility that the ship would sink. Douglas tried to stop Dario, but the lizard said that the pitching was really strange. Although the wind and waves seemed calm and after all his 12th elder brother has experience in predicting the weather, Ravi realized that the lizard has 12 elder brothers. He said that he has only 15 brothers and sisters. And the lizard realized that she was an only child. And then she shouldn't know what it's like to have many brothers and sisters. And that's a real headache. Suddenly, Ravi stood up and grabbed her close. Douglas looked at her puzzled and thought that something happened. Ravi, with an unclear face, started to tremble a little, and she said that nothing happened. The man looked at her questioningly, but the lizard thought that the girl was drunk and said that she could rest in the room below. Suddenly, something began to happen on the ship. The man didn't understand what was happening. One of the lizards told the captain that he had bad news. It was a squid, a giant squid to be exact, that started attacking the ship. His tentacles started to grab onto the Karma. The lizards tried to escape and ran up. The squid broke the side of the ship with his tentacles. Viaggio opened his mouth in shock and disappointment and screamed because the squid broke his Prince of the Breeze. Douglas realized it was a kraken and was surprised because it was an S-rank monster. And it wasn't the kind of monster that you'd find in coastal waters like these. Douglas screamed, trying to stop Dario, but he had already made a dash and was laughing loudly. He started jumping straight towards the kraken. Douglas was surprised that he was so fast, even faster than when he knew him. In fact, it seemed like his legs didn't even need any reinforcement. Dario thought that he wanted to have fun before the quest began. He used magic weapons, namely the scattering blade, as well as the meteor shower. The kraken began to scream as the meteorites fell on him at a furious speed, and a whirlwind arose from the blade, which began to simply crack into small pieces. Dario looked at his broken sword very seriously and realized that it had already reached its limit. He looked at the kraken, and the lizards behind him expected nothing less from him, especially from someone who had once been in a heroic squad. Douglas looked at Dario's work in shock. The kraken was shocked and began to fall into the water, missing several tentacles. The ship began to fight the waves. He started to sway from side to side. Everyone tried to keep their balance, but it didn't work. Ravi fell, and Douglas immediately started to worry about her and tried to find out if she was okay or not. The girl had a scraped knee and it hurt, but she said with a sad face that everything was fine. Douglas looked at her and was instantly afraid for her. Dario was sitting on the bow of the ship, but suddenly the kraken rose from the bottom of the sea. It started screaming and roaring. Dario realized that it was just big, and he grabbed his sword, but suddenly he realized that his sword was broken. Dario jumped back, which confused the kraken. It turned out that he hadn't jumped back. He had been thrown back. He realized it was wind magic, which meant it was Douglas. He shouted at the man because he didn't know what he was doing. But Douglas used spells, wings of solitude that protected the frozen lands. Dario looked at him, uncomprehending. But Douglas said he would take care of him. Douglas cried and said that right now he was furious, and he used the highest ice magic, namely the Ice Falcon of Raxus. The man commanded the falcon to freeze him. The falcon began to fly towards the kraken. The bird flew very close to the kraken. They started fighting. The falcon began to freeze the kraken, which began to scream louder and louder. An ice block grew in place of the kraken. Everyone on the ship was shocked by what happened. The lizards were delighted and finally became sure that they were saved. Dario was shocked by what Douglas did. He remembered how they fought a normal monster, namely, how Douglas fought. A nervous smile appeared on his face. There was a man standing on the stairs, and in the cabin next to the stairs sat Douglas and Robbie, and the father was treating his daughter's knee, which she had injured. He used his usual full healing and Robbie's knee was unscathed. Douglas apologized and wanted to make sure she didn't have any more pain. The girl confirmed it. Suddenly, the door creaked and Dario entered the cabin, who said with a displeased face that they would leave in half an hour, and the squid would be transported on another ship. They also said that they would get a huge amount of money for pacifying the informant. Dario was expecting some kind of answer, and he was also curious about what kind of ice magic it was. After all, he couldn't be stronger now than he was in his best times. After all, it's not every day that you see top-class magic. Robbie asked again about the top class. She was surprised every time by Dario's words. And he stood there surprised too, because she didn't know such simple things as skill rating. There are general skills called basic magic. Those that change the shape or power of objects are called first-class magic. And then those that generate life, referred to as high magic. And by the way, full healing is also considered a high-class magic. And it seemed like he could use it easily, but it wasn't a skill that was used for some scratches. Dario said that even his useless Fanny couldn't use him. Douglas asked Dario not to say that. And he said that he spoke directly, and as it is. Ravi watched their conversation sadly. Ravi turned to her father and said that she also wanted to practice magic. And with deep hope, she looked at her father to approve of her desire. Douglas looked at her with distrust and a little awkwardness, feeling sad, and sarcastically agreed so as not to upset his daughter. After all, Ravi has been practicing magic since Floria's time, namely the Elven Forest, but she hasn't achieved any results yet. He squatted next to her, thinking about what he could do about it. Ravi kept her hands at a small distance from each other. Douglas thought that he wanted to do something for her. He also tried to take a number of measures, how they could arrive in the city. But the girl continued to keep her hands at a distance. Douglas looked at her sadly, and was still thinking about how to help her. Dario stood next to him and finally spoke, because he realized that she couldn't use magic. Ravi became even sadder than before. Dario said that it could mean that she just lacked the ability. At the same time, the guy looked at her with a smug look. Ravi was trying to prove to the guy that she had the ability. Douglas also supported her, saying that her potential was definitely not less than 5,000. Dario said that it was enough for the lower upper class. After all, the sage class had at least 8,000. The man said that it was not important at all, and he decided to ask her what kind of magic she wanted to learn. The girl said that she wanted to learn light magic. Dario wanted to know why this particular choice, because even this old man's magic, she had seen before and had seen many others. And despite this, she still chose the magic of light. But in fact, the first magic gave rise to a strong desire. The guy asked to try to remember why exactly the magic of light, and then, if she has some predisposition to it, or more precisely, if she figured out what the trick was, then it wouldn't take her long to learn. Dario stood there as if he were her teacher, and Ravi sat on the bed and listened to him attentively but kept silent. Douglas was very surprised that Dario extended a helping hand. He looked at the guy without looking away, because he did not understand how such a serious person decided to give advice. Dario was surprised that Douglas was looking at him like that. After all, he had been taught these things before. The man immediately began to apologize in fear, and he felt very awkward because he was looking at him so surprised. Ravi looked at him with delight, and hearing him say that Douglas was bad at expressing his feelings with words, so he wanted to say something to her, but he couldn't say anything. Ravi shyly addressed the boy, calling him Big Brother. She was curious, so she decided to find out what magic he was able to learn first. Dario looked at her with a little confusion and surprise. Douglas felt that now there could be a dangerous lesson for his daughter, and he raised his hands trying to stop Dario. After all, he was the only one in the group of heroes who could not use magic, so he tried to stop her. But to Douglas's surprise, the guy's answer made him change his mind about him a little, because the guy said that he had already forgotten what magic was first. At the same time, he smiled a little strangely. At that moment, Dario said that he was going to bed, and added later, telling Ravi that her daddy should teach her everything else. The boy's behavior was increasingly surprising Douglas. His mouth no longer closed in surprise. The guy went to the door, opened it, and said that someone should wake him up when they arrived in Toyberry. And without waiting for an answer, he thanked them and slammed the door. After that, the guy went to his cabin, leaving the father and daughter alone. Dario walked down the corridor, thinking about something. Then the guy kept his hands on his hips and lowered his head. His path was illuminated only by one ship's lantern. Suddenly the door of the cabin the boy had just come out of opened, and Douglas looked out of the room, saying that he was surprisingly good at taking care of others. This surprised the boy, Douglas went on to say that he had no idea that he had such a side. And, oh, Dario said angrily that he did it just for fun. This answer confused Douglas, and after a short pause, he said that he was happy for him then. The guy did not understand what their conversation meant. He was about to leave, but Douglas kept talking. He remembered the conversation earlier, in the middle of which he had left. He didn't think he had taken it very well, and it seemed as if they had reminded him of something that had upset him. Dario looked at him, as if without emotion, but remained silent, after which he put his foot forward a little. At this, the guy laughed. It seemed a surprise to him, and he put his hand to his head. The guy advised, in that case, not to try to dig into the past again. After all, Alan would get mad at her for that. Douglas began to get irritated and angry with him. He immediately said irritably that there was no question of what he meant. The man stuttered. This began to irritate Dario. He looked at him with a displeased face. After a short silence, the guy said that he was not of the same blood as this chibi, calling him an old man again, and he was not her relative. Douglas immediately became embarrassed by his words. The man agreed, saying that he thought they were a real family now, however. Dario said with displeasure that he had already figured that out. Douglas looked at her in confusion. Dario thought for a moment and said that he had one. He repeated that he had a family too, and they were not related. It was 10 years ago, and when he was only 12 years old, Dario was called to eat. A happy little boy agreed to go and eat. It was a village where only children lived, and he grew up in one nameless place.